TSA.
Yes, TSA's coming today.
Yeah,
He is, he's the, yeah. Yeah. There's been studies, TSA was using this term without humanity. So what if everybody started doing that? The TSA finally be like, okay, cool, right. We know that what if change the standards of what they're gonna consider various activities. And it's like a human trait. We all do it with kids, and families, and it's kind of cool.
That's why I'm speaking.
That's right.
Lower
TSA 's gotta
everyone's
watch out.
standards. No. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, no.
Oh, yeah, tables. Moving on up.
Use the park lot.
Good morning, Hack the Capitol. Are we doing this again? Come on. Good morning, Hack the Capitol. Good morning. See, these are my favorite people right here. Look at this space up front, engaged, in arm's reach for me to play with them. If you think you're safe in the back, I can come back there too. We can do this a lot of ways. For those of you who've seen me speak publicly, I like to get out into the audience, but up here, I'm usually constrained back to the stage. As you can see, I'm also playing for time. That's kind of what's happening. So we've had some schedule changes because what conference is fun without things being completely in flux, just like critical infrastructure. So some housekeeping things. I know we have some new folks here today, so welcome to day 2 of Hack the Capitol. For what you missed yesterday, which will be posted to the ICS Village YouTube account, we will have the fireside with Jen Easterly. We will have all of the panels from track 1, and we will have the talks from track 2. Orienting you to the facility again, you have the wonderful place where there is food. You're in track 1. Track 2 and 3, I think, are both right over here. And then back down this direction, you kind of go past the cafeteria toward the end. That's where we have the villages. So we have the biohacking village. We have the Grim OT attack village. We have the lockpicking village. If you ever want to learn how to pick a lock, we got you. Aerospace village. And then sign-up sheets are in the main room here for being able to do tours to MITRE, DOE's Cyber Strike, and then the debut of the new CISA INL escape room, which is a lot of fun. So highly recommend getting to check that out. Some other things. Where's Ben? Have you met Ben? If you are a foreign national, which means you have a red lanyard, you need Ben to leave the area. That is part of the security rules. The other part that applies to all of us, your yellow lanyard needs to be visible. So please, don't hide yourselves. They want to know who you are, and they would like to be able to track you. Not in a creepy way, just in a secure facility way. So we have a fireside chat with the TSA administrator, David Pekoske, which will be starting shortly. In the meantime, I guess let's kind of throw it. Is there any questions from the audience? My favorite person already. Which question?
Is there opportunities to ask questions of the people coming up?
Are there opportunities to ask questions of the folks on stage? It really is panel and fireside specific. So some of the panels, I know they planned for Q&A and then they enjoyed themselves so much that they left no time for audience interaction. Track 3, which is brought by the Beer ISAC, so it's an informal operational technology professionals organization. That is meant to be a classroom style where the tracks are supposed to be very interactive. Those are Chatham House rules and are not being recorded. And I will give you your bio, sir, since you joined us. David Pekoske was first confirmed by the US Senate as the Transportation Security Administration's 7th administrator in August 2017 and was reconfirmed for a second term in September 2022. Sounds like a thing with karma. You must have done something wrong. You keep doing this. Pekoske leads a workforce of over 60,000 employees and is responsible for security operations at nearly 440 airports throughout the United States. TSA is also the lead federal agency for security of highways, railroads, mass transit systems, and pipelines. Under his leadership, TSA improved transportation security through close partnerships and alliances, a culture of innovation, and development of a dedicated workforce. And it's not in your official bio here, but you were an admiral in the US Coast Guard, right? Which I think is really cool. So I'm a former Army officer, and for those of you who are not aware, the Coast Guard is actually a really interesting service in this space. They're kind of the jack of all trades when it comes to title authorities because of the missions that they do. And so they're the intersection of a lot of different components of national security, counterterrorism, and domestic national defense.
Yeah, and shouldn't be lost on anybody that I'm the 7th Senate confirmed administrator. 2 of my predecessors were also Coast Guard flag officers. So the skills we develop in the Coast Guard, I think, are very, very applicable to the work in TSA. Thanks.
Your choice, left or right.
Makes no difference to me.
Okay, okay. I'll take the right. I haven't been on the side yet. Okay. So these are not Bud Lights. These are in fact waters.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
It wasn't meant to be a political statement.
Cheers.
So, sir, I understand you have some opening remarks you would like to kick off our fireside with.
Well, I would, and I'll be very brief because I really want to get to your cues and audience cues. This week marks the second anniversary of the ransomware attack on a major pipeline system, pipeline from Houston, Texas, up the southeastern seaboard. We all remember the impact of that ransomware attack, and that really caused us, as the regulatory agency for pipelines, which is not something that not a lot of people realize. And in fact, not a lot of people realize that we have any surface transportation security oversight responsibility at all. But it caused us to immediately put in place some regulations, and we call them security directives because it's not a formal rulemaking process we go through, because the law allows us to issue what we call security directives to accomplish things as quickly as we need to accomplish them to secure the transportation system. So we immediately issued directives to first and foremost report cybersecurity incidents. We found, not to anybody's surprise, that there was not a consistent reporting framework within the U.S. government, certainly within the transportation sector for that. So that was the very first thing we did in the month of May. So it was the same month that the incident occurred. We also required the identification of a cybersecurity point of contact. So as those incidents were coming in, that we could call someone or a team 7x24 to get information. The other thing that was different, and you'll hear me talk about how we have pivoted over the course of these 2 years to become, in our view, ever more effective in cybersecurity with our partners in the transportation sector. So that other thing was that rather than having the reporting come to TSA, we had that reporting go to CISA, our partner agency. I know Jen was here yesterday speaking with you. She and I have been key partners in this effort, and I think we've collectively been able to bring a good deal of government capability to this issue. So reports came to CISA, and then just a couple months after that, in July, we issued some very prescriptive cybersecurity requirements on the industry. But the difference we did there, and again, it's another difference in our regulatory approach, was we decided not to regulate every one of the roughly 3,000 pipelines in the United States. We worked with CISA, and we determined, hey, the definition we have for criticality within critical infrastructure was applicable, and so we said, hey, if you're determined to be a critical owner-operator, then you're covered by these regulations. Which, when you think about it, particularly in the realm of cybersecurity, we shouldn't try to lock ourselves down in the regulatory regime that needs to be changed all the time. We should try to put a framework in place that we can adjust as the circumstances adjust and as the industry adjusts. So, there are going to be owners and operators that are on the current list of companies that are covered by our directives that might fall off based on, a change in their status as to whether or not they're critical to that particular transportation subsector. But as you might remember from media reporting, when we issued those very prescriptive measures, the industry was in a position of saying, hey, are you saying to us that we need to stop what we're currently doing and do these instead? And are you open to a more non-prescriptive approach, a more performance-based approach? We have always wanted to go to performance-based rulemaking. And so for the very first time in TSA's history, we worked with the oil and natural gas industry, the less than 100 critical companies within that subsector. And we came up with a performance-based approach that replaced our very prescriptive approach literally a year after the prescriptive measures were put in place. In my view, and I think the industry would share this view, is that has been incredibly successful. We now require 4 outcomes to be achieved. We require a cybersecurity implementation plan, and then importantly, a cyber assessment program to be put in place so that when we look at the outcomes, we can look objectively and determine to what level are we achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve. We also required, and this really goes back to my Coast Guard background, it would go back to Jen Easterly's Army background, is that we knew it was important that we do two things at the same time. We improve the safeguards within critical infrastructure. Secondly, is we build resiliency within that infrastructure sector so that if attacked, the services that critical infrastructure sector provides could come back online quickly. And so part of that is a requirement to do a vulnerability assessment and then to have a response plan, a cybersecurity incident response plan in place. And then just recently, we got together with one company up in Boston, and we did a tabletop exercise on cybersecurity, which was really, really helpful because what that does is it gets us to the point of, hey, if there is a cyber attack and it has some impact on the provision of critical services in this country, I'm going to be in front of cameras. So is the CEO of the company, whether it's a pipeline company, a transit company, a rail company, an airline, or an airport. And we just need to step through the process upon which we are going to respond. So it goes from a prevention framework to really a resiliency crisis response framework, and making sure that we are really prepared for that, knowing full well that you're going to do a TTX and the actual incident is going to be somewhat different, but just getting together, understanding each other's perspectives, and going through the steps of, hey, how would we frame this response? Two last things I would mention is when we started with our regulatory framework, in cooperation and coordination and with great support from the National Security Council, we brought the CEOs of those pipeline companies into the White House, into the Situation Room, and gave them a top secret briefing on the threat, because we knew we were going to be asking a lot of the industry, and we wanted the CEOs who were going to be asked certainly by their CISOs to provide some more resource and more priority within the companies. We wanted the CEOs themselves to see what the threat was, to see why we were so concerned about this. I would label that as an absolute best practice, because that really paved the way for rapid implementation and really paved the way for continued top-level communications between myself and those CEOs, Jen Easterly and those CEOs, so that we now have a relationship framework, which is critically important for success and for partnership between the public and private sectors. And so that to me was something that we did, and we followed the very same pattern in rail and transit, and the very same pattern in aviation. And so that's something that I would definitely see us continue to do in the future.
So tying it to a leadership moment, the Colonial pipeline incident was a watershed, both in its effect as well as it is a communication and education opportunity. The way I've been describing it is it's what made ransomware a kitchen word. And it's also, I think, what made critical infrastructure a kitchen word. And when I mean kitchen word, the way I describe it is this is something when you're having breakfast with your grandmother, she would now understand, right? Ransomware was technical jargon before that moment. It didn't tie into something that was a part of daily life. And so kind of peeling back to what you as a leader went through, I mean, what went through your head when this incident was first briefed to you, in terms of the strategic surprise, perhaps, the state of the organization with what TSA could do and where you needed to go? Just what was that moment like?
Well, the moment was one, not so much surprise, right? Because we always knew there was a potential. The intelligence has continued to tell us that we've transitioned from oftentimes criminal actors to nation state actors in cybersecurity. So that was always in the back of our mind. And the other thing that's in the back of my mind is how well do I know the team at this company? And we did know them well because we did a lot of physical security work with Colonial Pipeline. So those things were going through our mind. And then the other thing that's really important, and this is something that I think you'll see us continuing to get better and better at, it's a demand, a rightful demand that the industry has made, is how are we going to coordinate this from a government perspective, right? Because I think the CEO at the time would tell you that he spent a lot of time on the phone answering the very same question from different government agencies at different levels in the government. And you really want to give that time back to the CEO so that he or she can manage the crisis that they're in. And so one of our very conscious efforts, and one of the things we tested when we did the TTX up in Boston, is how can we bring the government together in this? So that, for example, rather than all of us calling and getting our own separate information feed, that we could set up at the outset, hey, we're going to have a call at 11:30 in the morning, and we're going to have a call at 6:30 in the evening. We're all going to be on it, so that we all hear the same information. So there's not a little bit of a nuance between us, and we get the updates when we need the updates. And so I think that's all going through my mind, because right now when that happens, you pivot really quickly from a prevention standpoint to really a response standpoint, and you're hoping that there's some resiliency built in so that this can get back on its feet as quickly as it could. And I think if you look at let's take the pipeline sector, because they were the first sector that we provided our framework of performance-based rules in. If you look at that subsector's performance objectively between 2 years ago and today, we can see that there has been improvement there. And I don't want to provide many details now because we're still putting that together. But for me, it's very important to be able to say, hey, we did this. What was the evidence that what you did had effect? And of course, you can't and shouldn't attribute improvement just to a regulatory framework. I mean, there's a whole lot of other things going on at the same time. But our objective here is to make our critical infrastructure more protected and more resilient. So when we look at these measures, if we're getting there, it's great, and we'll give credit where credit is due to the industry and to the agencies that help that process.
So what does the evolution of that full vision look like, right? I understand that there's reasons to not tie into operational detail, and certainly things in motion. It's not always, we don't want to always share all that in public too, because we want to encourage progress where we have it, even if sometimes it's a flicker to make it a flame. But just tying to in your perfect world, what is the complete evolution of that vision? Where have we achieved some plateau? Because there's always continuous process improvement.
Right.
So it's not like we've hit 100%, but what does that 80, 90% look like from your perspective?
Sure. First and foremost, don't tie yourself down in process with respect to getting a framework in place. And to the extent you can tag to a framework that's a trusted framework that pretty much everybody would look at and say, hey, that's a good framework to anchor the work that you're doing, do that. And so we're in the process now by law. TSA can issue security directives in an emergency that have immediate effect. And that's what we used in pipelines, rail, and in aviation. Super handy authority to have. On the surface side, we are required by law to follow that up. If we want to continue those regulations in place, we need to follow it up with a formal rulemaking process. So when you get into a formal rulemaking process, as many of you know, that process takes years to complete oftentimes. And you want to make sure that, given the speed of change in cybersecurity itself, but I would also submit, hey, speed of change in physical security, to the extent you can tag your requirements onto an evolving standard, that provides the flexibility for everybody in the mix here. So the owners and operators, all their suppliers, the government agencies involved, all their customers. It provides us as much flexibility as we could possibly have in making sure that what we put out today can live for many, many more years into the future. Because if we just went to where we started back in July of 2021, if we stayed with those very prescriptive measures, they would be overtaken by technology in 6 months or 18 months. And that would be silly, because we can't turn a regulatory process within that time frame. So going to this performance-based model, which is something that the National Cyber Strategy calls for, I think is really the way to go. And we happen to be the agency that's been able to do this first because, one, the ransomware attack was on a transportation element of critical infrastructure. And secondly, we already had the regulatory framework and the legal framework within which to do it.
So one, I think that was the prevailing criticism of that security directive, is by being over prescriptive, you tripped from regulation for operational support into where you got in the way of where improvement could happen. And so how does the agency look at the balance of where we should regulate versus providing some other guidance, support, and of course recognizing that there's always the industry intransigence of thanks for the best practice guidance that's going over here.
Right. So, we've worked on best practice guidance for a good number of years. It's useful. I mean, it says to the industry, and by the way, our best practice guidance is always developed in very close coordination with the industry. We have the final pen on it. We're the agency responsible for security in that sector, but we really want robust owner-operator input into what we do. And so, what we did from July of 2021 to July of 2022 is we had a series of roundtables with the industry, and really just think of the learning that we achieved in that process, and also the learning the industry achieved in it, to get to a point where, hey, we'd all look at this and say, that's a very reasonable way to approach it. So, I think, given what we did and kind of how we evolved and how we evolved rather quickly, I would give a lot of credit to the industry that put the time and the effort into this. The other thing that I would say, and from your own career experience, one of the things that's very, very important, and particularly when you have a subset of the larger set of pipelines, for example, is to really take the time when there's not a crisis at hand to really get to know your partner and to visit their facilities, to kind of understand their business model, because oftentimes what happens in a crisis is inside the government, the agencies that have responsibility are all brought together, and then we're speaking in some ways for what we anticipate the industry's reaction to be, or what we know the industry's level of preparedness is. The more you know about that, and the more authentically you can speak to it, I think the better decisions come out of government as a result.
So information sharing is, I think, I don't mean this in a mean way, but is the platitude that we offer a lot for, that's the solution. Because it is the solution, but it turns out where it falls flat is the devil is in the details of how hard it is to do. Jen yesterday talked about JCDC, how JCDC started, how JCDC is growing. And you've already offered the example of the top secret briefs to the CEOs, which I like that idea because it ties into a concept of, I think there are only two kinds of companies when it comes to security. Leadership cares about security, leadership doesn't. And why that's so impactful is all too often our security champions in the community fight within a company that doesn't necessarily support, resource, or agree with them, and you're hitting your head against the wall. And so you're tackling that, but how do you maintain that? How do you scale that? And then how do you grow a more, because information sharing is also built on trust and relationship building. So how does that scale again across, you have three sectors you're also looking at, and are there nuances to that too?
So relationship building requires trust, and it requires transparency. And I would submit that we are very transparent with the public, even more transparent with the stakeholders within the transportation sector, because it's in our mutual best interest to be that way. Now, is everything available? No, necessarily no, but the vast majority is. And I agree that, hey, bringing the CEOs in, as I've stated before, and you just reinforced, that was really a great best practice. But what you need to do then are a couple things. One is, that can't be your one and done with the CEOs. That's got to be a continuing process. The second is that, and a lot of CEOs said this to me when we were issuing the invitations, is, hey, I'm the CEO, I'm not the cyber person. And so if you're going to ask me a lot of cyber questions, I'm not the right person to have at this meeting. And we said, no, we want to talk to you as the CEO, so you understand, like I said, when your cyber experts come and knock on the door and say, hey, we need to talk about something, that you already have that framework, or you call them in proactively. But to follow up, the chief security officers, the chief information security officers in companies, so both the physical and the cyber side, have pretty much all been applied for and been approved for security clearances. And then we have two bodies that regularly meet weekly, or sometimes multiple times a week. So it's a continuing thread of information sharing at the classified level. One is what's called the ADIAC, ADIAC. That stands for Air Domain information analysis cell. That's been in place for many, many years. As you can imagine, after 9/11, one of the key objectives of everybody was to connect the dots, bring the intelligence community together, make sure we learn from the industry what they're seeing too, because they may see some things that might refute or reinforce what we're seeing on the classified side. On the surface side, we didn't have any such formal structure in place. So we formed the Surface Information Sharing Collaborative, or SISC. Same framework is the CISOs and the CSOs in this case come in on a regular basis, and we share information at different classification levels depending on what needs to be discussed. But you know, as you know, and I think many of the people in the audience knows, you know, you can get intelligence information as kind of a one-shot brief, helpful. But really, what's more helpful is to understand more about the context. Hey, I'm hearing this today. How does that compare to what I heard 6 months ago, 8 months ago? And that's reflected really in what we did in the aviation sector just recently, this past March, is we issued an emergency amendment, so an amendment to their existing security plans that built in the same cyber framework for the most critical carriers and the most critical airports. And the reason we went on an emergency basis there was because we saw the threat stream developing in a way that we knew we needed to take very quick action. But having established that baseline, that was helpful with the industry because they already sort of understood where things sat 5-6 months ago.
You mentioned the anxiety, the fear that the CEOs had of coming to this brief of you're going to cyber nerd them, right? And of course, probably most likely, if I can guess what the intelligence brief covered, the technical specifics weren't the key part of it. It's again, threat, motivation, and capability.
And intent.
And understanding that, because that ties to you as a target, right? And that fits back into an overall risk framework of how any leadership should be looking at their organization. But this is a common challenge we have in both government and in the private sector, where leadership really is not cyber aware. They are still grasping with the change of the threat, the change of the capability. Again, where ransomware, I think, really leveled the playing field, is suddenly everybody was a target. And before, most folks, I think, thought, like, why would they come after me? And it's like, yes, everybody is now a target. Just the question is who and for what purpose and that intent. So how much do you feel that hampers things, that we still have that gap, that there's that anxiety to have those conversations? Because I can imagine a number of them were like, can I just send my CISO instead? Because I think that's who you really want. Right. And of course, going back to, we're trying to shape leadership understanding because that's what sets resourcing within that organization. And is there more that we perhaps can do either in the TSA, government writ large, nonprofit, private sector, to drive that education into leadership in the boardroom?
Well, I think a couple things. One is the information that's already being pushed out there. I think most CEOs are reading what's being presented in the news, what's being carried in trade publications, and they know this is something that they need to really be concerned about and really focus on. And I think over time, you're going to get more people that have grown up with cyber as a concern moving into those chairs. The other thing that is reinforcing to all this, and really it's one of the things that I like a lot about my job, is when I travel around the country and around the world, I don't just visit TSA employees and TSA facilities. I make a point of visiting our stakeholders wherever they are. And I ask for a meeting with the CEOs. In every case, I've been granted that privilege of sitting down with the CEOs, and it just reinforces in their own boardrooms, in their own offices, hey, this is how things are going. These are the challenges I see that we're facing. How do you feel? Any questions that we can ask about you? To me, success as the administrator is when something's really bothering a CEO, that person feels like they can call me and just say, hey, I'm hearing this. I'm really concerned about it. Can you help me out here? And as a taxpayer, that's kind of really what I think ought to happen in government. And really, the scale, you look at the number of organizations that you might regulate and say, hey, that's not realistic in terms of scale. I would submit that it is, because not everybody's going to call you. And you can always make 10 or 15 minutes, particularly for somebody who's running a critical piece of our national infrastructure.
So we have a new national cybersecurity strategy that's been published, and clearly TSA has a significant role in that. What is your view around the process of how that worked, the relationship with the Office of the National Cybersecurity Director, where Chris Inglis, who recently left, had always saw his role more as he's the coach and effectively y'all are the quarterbacks, and then the TSA's view of the strategy itself?
Yeah, I think the strategy is awesome. I mean, we had a hand in reviewing the drafts and putting some recommendations in. I see when I read the strategy, affirmation of a lot of the things that we're doing. I see a great emphasis on supply chain, on international baselining as well. And so I think the cyber strategy is terrific. Chris and I were both commissioners on the Cyber Solarium. So that's helpful too, and I knew him when he was the deputy director over at NSA, and I was the vice commander of the Coast Guard. So the personal relationships were there. I think they've really performed a very important role. I would take it just one step further, though, is that now we have a deputy national security advisor for cyber and for emerging threats. That's been really in the policy-making apparatus of government. A lot of things work through the national security process, and that's been enormously valuable to us as a sector risk management agency, because when it gets tactical or operational a little bit below the strategic level, you've got a strong partner there to help out and to bring things together and to get decisions made at the EOP level. And then I would highlight too CISA and that team. I mean, you mentioned JCDC. What we're trying to do is, CISA is relatively new. TSA is actually relatively new, 21 going on 22 years old. The whole scheme of government agencies, that's relatively new. We are trying very hard to figure out how we can complement and reinforce each other. And so Jen's work in JCDC is a place that we recommend our owners and operators, if they've got something to share or want some information, use that vehicle because it's enormously helpful. And then, as a sector risk management agency, TSA is a co-sector risk management agency. So there are several agencies involved. There's TSA, Coast Guard on Maritime, and Department of Transportation as a safety element of the sector risk management agency work. We develop the sector risk planning, right? But we can't develop that planning in isolation of the planning that's going on in the other sectors. I mean, we may be relying, for example, in transportation, on another sector being able to provide a certain capability that if you read their plan, you say, wow, they don't think they can provide it. So why are we putting it in our plan? And that's a very valuable role for CISA going forward that they're working really hard on is how can we identify where the gaps are across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors to make sure that there's good harmonization there. The last piece is the harmonization piece. When we put our requirements out for cybersecurity reporting, pretty shortly thereafter, the Congress passed a cybersecurity reporting bill, and then as part of that bill, there's a requirement to kind of harmonize across the federal government our reporting requirements. And so what the Department of Homeland Security and the policy shop under Secretary Rob Silvers did, and he's got the lead for this, is seeing how we can harmonize our reporting requirements. And the reporting requirements are just part of the equation, because when people report information, when I report information, I expect to see something back from it. Not just a, hey, thanks, we got your info, but hey, just so you know, in the whole context of the reporting that we've gotten for the slice that's most applicable to you, this is what we're seeing. So you kind of see, what you're reporting. How does your reporting comport with the reporting, for example, of other pipelines or other freight rail systems? That's helpful for an owner operator. So this harmonization effort is underway. One thing I think that we're going to need to take a very careful look at, though, is there are certain things that really need to get reported very quickly. Because just think of this is, we did the TTX up in Boston, and where the information started to come in the exercise to all of us exercise participants was through social media. Social media is going to turn on minutes, right? And so what's already going to be in the public domain is the fact that there's an incident. And we just need to recognize the fact that, our reporting needs to be at speed, so we have, really more detailed content that we can use to develop a response. So that's something we'll be thinking about surely as we work the harmonization going forward.
So that was the first time I was aware that sectors were being recommended into JCDC, which of course makes sense. There's a lot of shared threat. And we're going back to information sharing, and while sectors are more from this is ease of unit responsibility effectively within government, the threat to security doesn't work that way, and there's interdependencies. So is this something where there's a potential that the evolution is that the JCDC construct expands with effectively subsector components that TSA would be running within it then?
I don't think so. The structure and when those to me were two discrete things. JCDC is where owners operators can go and collaborate on what they're seeing from a cyber perspective. The Sector Risk Management Agency responsibilities and looking at cross-sector risk is kind of a separate but related topic. One of the things that's important, and as a regulator, I know full well that some owners and operators are not going to want to tell me everything that I might want to know, right? That's just reality. But I do want them to make sure, and so does Jen, want them to make sure they can take advantage of the resources and the capability that the federal government has. Federal government has an interest in, if I were in CISA or I were in the FBI, I would have an interest in knowing kind of what's going on before it manifests itself somehow, if I don't get it from another means of communication. So that JCDC has real value in being the penalty-free place you can go and just talk about and talk through and share the information that you have. I think in some ways putting a regulator in that mix might change the conversation. And so we'll just kind of try to figure out. One, it's important to get the information flowing first and foremost. I think Jen would reinforce that. Secondly, figuring out and making sure that the participants know how that information is being used is something that we're still working on. But I really do like the way that Sector Risk Management Agency's role and relationship with CISA is developing.
The Boston tabletop exercise, TTX, that you've been mentioning, how are those tabletop exercises designed? Like looking at how you're combining the threat that you're putting into it to designing the injects to actually running the exercise. Is this something that is going to be more frequent? What is TSA building out in that capability?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more frequent. It'll start off on a volunteer basis. What we like in terms of a framework here is one that all the relevant federal agencies participate, because again, trying to make sure that we can coordinate how we're going to ask for information, how we're going to respond. As an owner operator, I would like to see that, and really, some owner operators, no surprise, just like for us, some things we see is in a tabletop exercise, you're going to have some ahas. Oh, okay, I didn't know they did that, or I didn't know this would be how they would respond first. That's really good to know, and certainly out of any TTX, there are going to be best practices that come out of that, so we can learn more collectively. The other part is that I think it's critical in a TTX that one, senior leadership is there, because at the end of the day, in a major incident, it's going to be the very senior leadership that's going to be in front of a camera, and having some experience with this topic area, I think prepares everybody more for it, and really it helps us build public confidence, right? Because the public is going to be listening to that, maybe not the first one, but follow-on ones if the incident still goes on, and they're going to take a cue of, oh, hey, does my government and does the affected organization have a handle on this, and do I have confidence that they're going to be able to address it? So I think that piece is critically important, and we do want to begin to conduct these more regularly, because there's just so much. There's a big difference from preventing a cyber incident to being able to respond to one, because you go from prevention measures to a crisis response, and the crisis response framework can be a little bit different than the prevention framework.
Yeah, people respond differently.
Right.
People and organizations respond differently under pressure.
Right.
And I always find that a tabletop exercise, you find those gaps where folks just didn't even have the expectation. And it's the kind of thing where when you're under pressure, and as you noted before, when things were a little more chaotic within the reporting guidelines, so you're constantly getting the administrative what's happening at the same time as you're trying to figure out what's happening, and you haven't done a proper tabletop exercise, you haven't trained the process, so you're also trying to figure out how you even respond at the same time.
Or to anticipate the information needs, right?
Yeah. And so you're getting the leadership training and you're validating some of the leadership and organizational capability at the same time. What additional training or industry support capabilities do you think you would like to build then on top of that?
Well, I think more training. I think for industry, I'd kind of go back to something we talked about a few minutes ago. Is for them to understand how serious this is at the top of industry, to know that, hey, training in this is going to be important. So let me put some resources to that, and really for the COO or the CEO to show up, when maybe kick it off. I mean, just to reinforce it with people. The other thing on the TTXs is for the CEO ideally or the COO to participate in the TTX, because that way you're going to get a good feel for, hey, how prepared do I think my team is for this? And when the TTX is over, you can kind of huddle after that and say, hey, I heard this. Help me understand. What more do you need? Is there additional training? Are there additional resources that we need to put to this?
So the other strategy that ONCD is working on is workforce development. Workforce development clearly as a leader is a challenge with the regulations and the capabilities require trained TSA professionals to be able to execute that. And then of course, we as a whole of nation need to also be building a stronger pipeline of the technical talent and the leadership that can in fact be holding their side. And I always tie this back to the military one because we're both anchored there, but so much of how the military works is the ability to train people to scale. I think that's one of the impressive parts about what the U.S. military is able to do is taking the wider population and then turning them into competent functional areas. So looking at that from your view, where do you see TSA's role in that strategy?
Great question. And when we first started back in May of 2021, we didn't have a very big cyber staff. And so that was a big concern is, hey, how successful are we at being able to bring in talent? What we found, and I don't know if Jen talked about this when she was here, but there is a system called the Cyber Talent Management System that basically stands for this premise, is that you can bring cyber talent into the federal government at a higher level than you might otherwise. A little bit of a pay differential that's more favorable. But the idea when it was put together was we can't ever successfully chase the salaries in the private sector. And really, I'm not sure we want people that just want to do the work for the pay. And so we set it a little bit higher, recognizing that the average compensation was higher in the private sector, but not crazy high like I think some people might have wanted. But the other thing was to encourage people to come into government, get the experience, and then feel free to leave the government with the idea that you'd be welcome back if you want to come back. And having that back and forth, I think, is hugely helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it shares a lot of information and perspectives on how industries work. I mean, I know a little bit about operating technology in pipelines, but every time I interact with a pipeline company, I learn just a little bit more. And that cumulative learning is very, very important. The other thing that's really important in my view, even perhaps more so, is you build a network, right? You build a network where you know people that, hey, in a crisis, you can call and just get some quick advice, so that I don't think anybody wants to see the government on an island and the owners and operators of critical infrastructure on an island. We're all on the same island, and to the extent we can freely exchange information back and forth, and then formally exchange it as well, but do it in a way that facilitates the recovery and facilitates the response, I think makes a lot of sense. By the way, what we found is when we needed talent to come into TSA, we had a good number of people that thought, hey, this is novel what they're doing. They're going to be one of the first out of the box doing it, given that their authorities already provide the opportunity to regulate in this domain. And so we had people come in just for that experience, which is hugely helpful to us, right? And most of them are still with us because we still got a lot more work to do. And part of that work that we're doing that I think is going to be most interesting is, we have the industry developed cybersecurity implementation plans, which is basically them saying, hey, these are the things I'm going to do to achieve the outcome that you've established. And then the follow-on cybersecurity assessment programs, which basically says, here is objectively how I'm achieving this outcome, as I mentioned before. But the really important part of that is the do loop that's in there, is how you get the assessment program, we get it, industry puts it together, we collectively look at it and we say, hey, basically out of a scale, for example, of 1 to 10 on outcome achievement, where are we? And where do we really want to get to? And so can we, let's say we're at a 7, can we get to 8 in the next year or so, and just progressively improve that progression, but doing it based on objective data that we didn't prescribe, right? That the industry provides, but we may look at what they provide as an individual owner operator and say, no, hey, as we're seeing across this sector or what we've seen in other sectors, here's another thing that we'd like you to report on, and then give them time to be able to report that. So, I think that reinforcing process of objective data on an outcome-focused regulation is going to be really important for us, because it will be able to answer the question of how much more prepared are we based on what we're doing, and did it make a difference and prove that it made a difference here before we have an incident?
Oh, it's always good to be before the incident, right?
Absolutely.
Left the boom, right?
Yeah,
The more
absolutely.
the more you train in peace, the less you bleed in war. And so that's the same thing we were talking about with the benefit of the tabletop exercises, where we identify those gaps in understanding and people and training and capability before we're under the pressure. So Presidential Policy Directive 21, which formalizes the critical infrastructure definition and the sectors. That is currently under discussion for update. And so looking at it from your view, I think one of the things that has been noted is when everything is critical, nothing is. We continue to look at adding more to it, which makes it harder. Again, tied to the fact that a lot of the agency capabilities, not just yours, but multiple agencies for the different SRMAs, are building as they are first funded to build. I think TSA is a great example of that. CIS is another great example of that, where the cybersecurity capabilities, TSA is young in the overall scope, CIS is even younger, and trying to build up within the challenge of talent. So PPD 21, how should we look at the tiering of different sectors from a priority perspective? What other updates should we look? And then, considering TSA is a regulator, where do you think there should be discussion of a change in regulatory authority, if any?
Yes, great questions. And we're participating, as all SRMAs are, in the PPD 21 review, and I think that's really important. It's time. A lot has changed since it was first published, so it's really important that we take a look at that and agree definitionally on some things, and really kind of work outside of our own silos too, which was always the intent. I think we see that even more acutely today. So I think that's critically important for us going forward. And we try very hard to make sure that we bring. I talk all the time with my counterparts over in the Department of Transportation, because things, for example, that we might do for cybersecurity protections for aircraft. FAA has key authorities there and more expertise than we do. And so, an agreement, and this is really beneficial to the industry, so that they don't have competing federal agencies trying to regulate the same topic, is, agreement between FAA and TSA on cybersecurity provisions and airworthiness certification, for example. That's something that I think is FAA's purview. I don't want to be involved in it because I don't think I would improve it, but I want to have an input into it along the way. So those kinds of things are also developing amongst the co-sector risk management agencies. Same thing with respect to the Federal Railroad Administration and positive train control. Right? It's hey, PTC is a safety system, but my experience in the Coast Guard, because Coast Guard does both safety and security missions, is that they're really two sides of the same coin. What you do in safety can have a positive or negative security impact, and vice versa is true. So let's make sure we look at them together in tandem. But I do think too, granted a little bit biased based on the chair that I sit in now, that having the separation and the focus on those two major elements is helpful. I look at international models where it's still together, and I think we're stronger with the focus we have, but ensuring that we're working together as agencies.
So all of our questions have been contained so far to the domestic sphere.
Mhm.
But one of the things that I think makes cybersecurity and the interconnectivity of devices so different is the traditional defensive strength of the United States of having the two large blue walls as one of the greatest defenses of all time on an international stage is international partnerships. And so can you share the growth and the vision there with international partnerships?
Yeah, and I travel extensively internationally, and I'm interested in developing as close international partnerships we can, both on a bilateral and a multilateral basis as possible. The International Civil Aviation Authority, for example, organization rather, ICAO, has a cybersecurity work stream that's quite good, and so we work with the other 191 member countries in further developing and strengthening their cybersecurity framework. When we travel bilaterally, one of the things that we're working on in the aviation sector is something called one-stop security, which means that if you depart a foreign airport that has direct flights to the United States, that if we're successful in moving this initiative forward, which Congress has given us the authority to prototype, that when you leave that last point of departure airport and you arrive in a U.S. domestic airport, and you have follow-on U.S. domestic travel, that you don't need to get rescreened in the United States, that you can go from the sterile area of the airport and stay in the sterile area and not have to go through screening, and that importantly, that your checked baggage literally goes from tail to tail in the aircraft. But one of the things we need to make sure is that there are cyber protections on the information that we're transmitting back and forth to each other, not just in terms of policies and procedures and intelligence, but also in terms of image data. We might take an image from a check bag and transmit that in near real time before the passenger even boards the aircraft to determine whether or not we want that check bag on the plane. And so having those kinds of cyber protections in existing programs is really important. And there's not a conversation I have with an international partner that does not include cyber as one of the first things we talk about, because everybody's interested in how are you doing it, right? And from both sides of the equation, hey, how are you protecting from a cyber perspective? Their question to us is how are we doing it? Where it always goes to, which is good, is and what benefit have you? How can you prove that we're having an effect here? How can we reassure ourselves that our systems and this globally interconnected, one of the most in the world, is working well? And the other thing with aviation is that it's not just passenger travel; it's supply chain, it's cargo. There's a lot of all cargo traffic that goes back and forth on aircraft, and a lot of pure cargo that goes on board passenger aircraft.
Can you provide an example of either something that we have shared that is beneficial or that we have learned, or both, with an international partner?
Yeah, I think one thing that we are sharing kind of works both ways, and it underpins part of this one-stop security is the idea of, in our technology, adopting an open architecture framework so that we can share algorithms with each other and do it in a secure manner. And most importantly, that, hey, as the threat changes, one of the things that we're working really hard in TSA on is the threat's always changing. And it changes so fast that we can't rewrite our detection software in our X-ray technology, for example, or our on-person screening technology, sometimes fast enough to keep up with where we think the threat is developing. So what we'd like to do is to have an open architecture framework where to trusted vendors, because there's got to be a lot of security built into this, that if we have a new threat developing, we can just go out on a 90-day RFP, request for proposals, and say in 90 days, give us your proposals to develop a software solution for this. So we aren't doing a manual process to detect a threat that can be done better automatically. The other thing in aviation that's really big right now is using artificial intelligence and machine learning to automatically detect items in primarily carry-on bags. Because right now in the United States, we automatically detect explosives. So the technology software can automatically detect the explosives that we're concerned with. What we cannot automatically detect are all the forms of knives, firearms, brass knuckles, you name an item that you don't want in a secure area of an airport. The technology exists to be able to do that. And we're working very hard with a lot of partners on that process, because really what we'd like to be able to do is to reduce cognitive load on the part of our officers. So you don't have to look at the image of every single bag. And to give you a sense for scale, just domestically here in the US, there are about 5 million bags that we x-ray every day. And so, if you can put a technology solution into that will automate part of it, and make sure that adversaries can't get into that system, I think that's very beneficial for all of us. So it's all part of a larger, across the entire global system of how can we share technology advancements so we all get collectively better. And really the key driver behind one-stop security that, coming into the US and then not getting rescreened is, by definition, the law requires us to make sure that the international system security procedures are comparable to the United States. That's a key word. It doesn't say it has to be exactly the same. So comparable to the United States, but if comparable, then really, in most cases, those flights inbound to the US are more secure.
Well, and in our pre-conversation, I learned AI means administrator's intent.
Yep.
I was confused at first when I overheard we were talking AI. I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
But the staff corrected me that we were not talking about artificial intelligence.
Yeah, AI is a document I use that underpins our strategy. So we have a strategy that goes out to 2026. We published in 2018. That's, as designed, we want it to be a living document rather than redoing a strategy every 2 or 3 years, which some agencies find themselves in the cycle of doing. And my ability as the administrator to put an imprint on that strategy is through the administrator's intent. So it's basically, hey, given the strategy, here are the things we're going to accomplish in this short 2 or 3 year window, because that's about as long as it's applicable for.
And I think AI and the implementation you discussed is so critical when you look at it from a consistency and a quality control perspective, because the manual inspection of that much does not work well for the human attention span. It's just not the way we were built.
Right.
I always think the metaphor I use when I talk about this in security, the hardest job is to be a guard, because you sit there for 8 to 12 hours and your whole fight is boredom. It's attention span. And that's the same challenge that you have in a security implementation for what you're doing in those sectors.
And really, I think most security agencies would tell you that, primary detection is good. It's in secondary inspections that we sometimes miss things that primary detected. And part of that is because of that fatigue factor you just mentioned. I mean, and just look at the way we do aviation security. I mean, we do differentiated screening, which means that if you're a trusted traveler, somebody we know more about, that you've given us your fingerprints, you've given us your facial image, and we've done a background check on you, that we don't provide the same security attention to you because you're trusted that we do when you're doing security operations for 2.5 million people. You've got to focus on those that you don't know anything about, or those that you do know something about that concerns you, and you might be able to not put as much time into those you trust.
So this is the final question. This is always my favorite one.
Okay.
And you could probably just cheat and say the administrator's intent of what will happen in 2026 is the answer. But let's see what we go. Okay. So I like this question because it takes you out of the constraints of organizational inertia, politics, of practical reality of what we can do. And so you're given, because it's magic, it's truly air gap, a magic wand that you get to wave and change one thing instantaneously at any scale to accomplish an improvement in critical infrastructure for the TSA. What would that be?
Resources. No, seriously.
Congress, you heard the answer.
Yeah, that's a significant constraint that we have. And, I think particularly in the Department of Homeland Security, our resource base is, I can tell you, I am way, way underinvested in IT. Because what happens whenever your budget is tight, the place that you can take things out of that don't provide an immediate effect, that you hope is not a long-term issue, is out of IT. You can buy fewer computers. Out of training and development, you can make quarterly training, semi-annual training, things like that. And to a degree, out of human capital support systems. And so those are the back-end systems that don't get a lot of attention. and really when you put them in the budget process, don't generate a lot of excitement. But when you have year over year over year of underinvestment in those, it causes a great deal of concern because you can't cut any further because you're going to start to affect your core mission performance, but you really can't project forward much either. So that's the biggest thing. If I could fix anything, it would be to have a more reasonable budget process. You know, one of the interesting things about TSA is that TSA's funding base is offset by the collections from a fee that every passenger pays every time they buy a ticket. When you buy a ticket, you're paying $5.60 one direction. If you have a whole series of legs, you'll pay a maximum of $11.20. That goes into the Aviation Security Passenger Fee Fund. The proceeds from that fund offset our appropriations. So if we have an $11 billion appropriation and that fund provides $5, only $6 is appropriated. So it really reduces the amount of taxpayer funds that need to be used for TSA. But what happened in 2013 in the bipartisan budget agreement was that it was decided that today it was kind of an escalating funding number, but in fiscal 24 terms, $1.6 billion of what people are paying in a fee for aviation security goes right to the Department of Treasury for deficit reduction. And so my pitch and the president's pitch in legislative proposals has been, stop that. Put the fee to the purpose it was originally intended. What I could do with $1.5 or $1.6 billion and what kind of passengers, if they're aware of the fee, are expecting is being spent is pretty miraculous, right? And I think that there's enough oversight of the things that we do, either from the IG, from the GAO, from oversight committees in the Congress, that if we're misusing or misapplying funds, that will be identified at some point. And I think we're pretty responsible with respect to the funds that we're entrusted. So all I want the funding I need to do to complete my core mission. And I want to make sure that what passengers are paying for the services that we provide are actually being manifested in the money that we get to spend every year.
David, appreciate it so
Thank
much
you.
that you came and joined us here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Great talking with you. Thanks, everybody.
Bryce, nice to meet you in person. Sure you can.
We needed to explain to them about
Okay,
why
so
we
he's got it
needed
on
to
right
run this
now.
authorities. Colonial,
Okay, so
in addition to that.
Yeah.
Wait, I'll let you go, but I
Thank
just
you.
want to say that.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
You and I have chatted over email.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay. So
Nope. I'm Bryson.
I'm sorry, Bryson. Bryson, I'm Verge.
Nice to meet you.
Are you? Are you gonna turn yourself on when you're ready? Yes. And are you all comfortable? Do you need to move around so you can see each other a little bit better?
No.
Okay.
So the
That's
feedback
what I
you get
kinda
into your
figured.
mics that you hear is also what the folks watching at home will hear as well.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do your bio when I do the panel introduction?
No, I could do my own. Just give me the name. Where's next? Where's next for you after this? Where are you going next?
That's all right. That's why Sherry's.
After that.
Cyber-informed questions.
You're live.
This is the panel on cyber-informed engineering, secure by design. I feel like we've heard that mentioned a few times, so how prescient. For critical infrastructure, the National Cybersecurity Strategy's call for secure by design applies not only to software, but is a key performance factor for all critical infrastructure sectors threatened by cyber vulnerabilities and risk. The National Cyber-Informed Engineering Strategy, published in June 2022 for the energy sector, is a resource for all critical infrastructure sectors. It is being implemented by stakeholders from education, government, national laboratories, manufacturers, installers, and asset owners. The goal is to design and specify cyber protections and mitigations early in new technology development and design as a standard engineering practice, particularly when attacks to operational technologies, including industrial control systems, can threaten human safety. This panel will discuss initiatives and plans to implement this strategy.
Over to you.
All right, go ahead and get started. So first of all, Sherry, Verge, thrilled to be able to share the stage with you on a subject for which I feel very passionate about. For those of you who don't know, I'm Lucian Niemeyer. I'm currently CEO of a nonprofit organization. I realize a cybersecurity nonprofit is probably the stupidest thing in the world to do. But in the previous life, I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense, running the largest real estate portfolio in the world, to include all the energy and environmental programs associated with the Department of Defense. So I come at this with a lot of experience with the National Security Agency about how important it is for us to get the engineering right as we are looking at any mission set. And really, the work that I did in the Department of Defense led to the stand-up of a nonprofit that is developing performance frameworks discussed in the previous panel on what we need to do in every sector to enhance cyber security and cyber safety. So I'm thrilled to share the stage with some experts that are devoted also to the idea of a cyber-informed engineering strategy. And I would like to really give a moment here for you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into some questions. We definitely want audience participation. Matter of fact, we can probably make this a small roundtable if you all want to move up, and we can have a discussion. But we definitely want to be able to get the audience involved in what is cyber-informed engineering, why it is so important, and why the country needs this moving forward to ensure we're implementing standardized quality cybersecurity standards across all infrastructure sectors, not just energy, for which it was originally written. So Sherry, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your role with this cyber engineering strategy?
Thanks, Lucian, and thanks to MITRE for hosting us today. My name is Sherry Caddy. I'm the Deputy Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Technology Research and Development at the White House, and we're really excited to have discussed and affirmed the National Cyber Informed Engineering Strategy in the most recent National Cyber Strategy that we just released in March. And my background, I've been back at the White House for a little over 6 months now. Prior to that, spent 2 years at the Department of Energy and the cybersecurity office there. And then prior to that, quite a number of roles in the intelligence community, really focused on technically focused public-private partnerships, technical enablement of cybersecurity, secure information sharing, secure threat sharing, and overall topics related to technology and cybersecurity. So really excited to be here today to talk about what I think is a perhaps underserved area in cybersecurity, and that is talking about cybersecurity for engineers and physical systems. We've heard a lot about security by design. I'm sure it's been mentioned here at this conference in the last couple of days. I know CISA has recently put out principles on cybersecurity for software, but we don't want to forget the physical parts of critical systems, particularly our critical infrastructure, and the folks that create those physical systems, design, develop, maintain those systems are engineers. They're not the typical IT folks. So we want to make sure that we're getting to that audience, and we're going to talk more about that today. But let me hand it over to my partner, Verge.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm Verge Gibson. I'm currently an advisor for Idaho National Laboratory. Prior to that, I spent 30 years in the intelligence community working a variety of cybersecurity issues. When it comes to cyber-informed engineering, I'm passionate about it. I led the working group that drafted the National Cyber-Informed Engineering Strategy for the Department of Energy. And if our collective passion doesn't come through, we're failing. I firmly believe that cybersecurity is hugely important, but ultimately is insufficient. And the true answer is changing the architecture, changing our systems to be able to plan for defense against cyber adversaries. And so cyber-informed engineering is, in my opinion, the single best approach to be able to do that.
Yeah. All right, so we share a passion on this. And I'm an architect by degree. You probably all didn't know that. So I've spent my entire life building things. And I agree with you 100%, Verge. It needs to start in the requirement stage. So Sherry and Verge, as we look at this strategy, what do planners need to do? Requirements, folks. How do you start that, applying some of the principles in the strategy before you even put the first pen to paper on designing a system, whether it be an energy system or a school or a car or a plane? What are the things we need to pull out of the strategy that will inform those planners, and designers before we start?
Well, let me talk first a little bit about the strategic intent here. Really, again, we're trying to get to engineers, people that are building physical systems, part of critical infrastructure. But really, we're trying to advance security by design. And ultimately, we're looking at changing the culture that engineering really abides by. Engineers have a great long tradition of a culture of safety that's been evolving over the last many decades. And safety is a reflexive thing that engineers do automatically. So how do we use the best practices from that culture of safety and apply them similarly to security, so that engineers, when they design systems, when they begin to build them, one of the first things they think about is, how am I going to make this secure? It's going to be digital in some form or fashion. Everything is now. So how do you make that the first thing that folks talk about, think about as they're doing their various roles? So really, that was the intent behind this cyber-informed engineering strategy. This was a great task that the Department of Energy received from Congress. This was tasked in the fiscal 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, directed Energy to stand up a task force, which I led, to work on cybersecurity for control systems. It's a really critical part of our critical infrastructure, and need to have more focus on operational technology and control systems, especially with the coming convergence of IT and OT. So how can we take some of the lessons learned in securing IT, begin to apply them to OT, begin to apply them to engineers? I like to think about this strategy as increasing the recommended daily allowance of cybersecurity for engineers. Not that they've never seen it before, and maybe they've tasted it, but we know that they need more. And that's not just electrical engineers, that's all engineers of physical systems. That could be building engineers, mechanical engineers, even civil engineers that pour concrete. They tell me, well, I don't really need cybersecurity, but everything now has sensors in it. So everything's being digitized. So really, cybersecurity is for all things. And so that was the intent of the strategy, is to really get after some of these big critical areas. And again, delighted that in the recent national cybersecurity strategy, it did name and affirm the cyber-informed engineering strategy as critical for securing our clean energy transition, as well as various aspects of operational technology.
Sherry, I love your association with engineering and safety. You know, if you think back for thousands of years, people, when they set out to build something, engineer something, design something, they focused on functionality and reliability. And it really wasn't until quite recently, you know, the 1970s, 80s, where safety got ingrained as a foundational tenet of engineering. And now there's not, I think, an engineering school in the world that doesn't teach safety as part of the curriculum. So one of our goals with cyber-informed engineering is to make security, especially cybersecurity, that same commonplace foundational tenet for engineering. And as you were saying, the National Cyber-Informed Engineering Strategy and cyber-informed engineering writ large, they're focused on the engineer and the technician, an underserved audience when it comes to thinking about cybersecurity and how to ideally eliminate cyber risk. So, so Lucian, to get back to what does someone need to do to implement this? I think step one, hear about cyber-informed engineering. So tell your friends, tell your not friends, and then step two would be to learn about cyber-informed engineering. And so we are trying to spread the word, increase awareness, events like this, but increasingly you'll see opportunities to learn the details of what cyber-informed engineering comprises and how does one go about applying those cyber-informed engineering principles. And a lot of this is nascent, so it will be evolving, I would expect, for the coming years, and there's an opportunity to craft it to apply specifically to your individual needs, to specific engineering or architecture needs. So you know, it's a chance to get in on the ground floor, and there's a lot to do here.
Yep. So for one thing, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sherry.
Oh, I was just going to say, you made me think of one thing, you know, as this is definitely an evolving strategy, and I want to give, you know, credit where credit is due to INL for really developing this philosophy for the past decade. And we did look back and, you know, for this audience, certainly appreciate, bless you, can certainly appreciate it that, you know, the people ask me, where did this phrase come from, cyber-informed engineering? It's a little bit of a mouthful. Turns out that the late, great Mike Asante was the originator of that when he was at Pacific Northwest National Labs. And INL has really evolved this concept and into this strategy. And I think a lot of it's informed by the great testing work that INL has done in the past decade, really looking into cyber vulnerabilities in physical systems and understanding that really we're not talking necessarily about vulnerabilities, but we're talking about design weaknesses. And a lot of the testing of systems, the looking at why systems are failing from a cybersecurity perspective, gets into, you know, not just a vulnerability that can be patched, but an actual design element, physical things that are arranged in a way that makes them not securable. And that the only way then to make that system secure from a cybersecurity perspective is to physically move things, to redesign things. So really understanding and getting people focused on design weaknesses, even beyond vulnerabilities, I think is a key principle here.
So I was struck by the last session. Let's talk about that for a little minute, because I want to get this off my chest when it comes to safety. And engineers is only going to respond to what an owner wants. And that can be anybody in the engineering community. So really what you've got to do is ensure you've got an owner requirement coming in. One thing that David mentioned in the previous session, and a lot of times he's got to convince CEOs that they need to attend the meetings in order to hear what the threat is to their infrastructure, as opposed to sending their CISO or the CIO. And my concern here is that CEOs don't realize they have a personal liability for human safety. And when they do realize that there's a pipeline that can blow up or a pipeline that can do a discharge and have a catastrophic environmental impact, it's a bad day for them, not for their CISO, not for their CIO, but for them. So how do we, in implementing this, it's great to be able to say engineers go do this, AE firms go do this. But if they're not taking the demand signal from the owner, they can only go so far. So from my perspective, you have to impart to a CEO of any owner of an asset, whether it be a pipeline, whether it be an energy system, that they have to ask for and require the implementation of this strategy as a requirements document. So then that firm can respond and build it for them. So what can we do in the community of practice to get asset owners to say, I want this, I want to adhere to this strategy? And that's to me a big step.
So you raise a great point, Lucian, and this is really one of the fundamental themes that is picked up in the national cyber strategy, which is really, we've been letting market forces do their thing. We've looked at voluntary compliance, voluntary measures to get to basic cyber hygiene. That has made some progress, but it's only gotten so far that quite a number of folks in the C-suite make short-term decisions based on the latest quarterly earnings when investing upfront in cybersecurity, particularly security by design, baking security in at the earliest possible stage is going to pay dividends later. So really that's one of the higher level strategic conversations that we're having of how can we, through government, through the highest levels of policy, begin to incentivize folks to make what might be a greater investment at the outset to avoid the heartbreak of cyber, very costly into the millions of dollars cyber incidents downstream, to include safety issues, loss of life when it comes to physical systems. So that is part of the national dialogue that we're definitely looking at across cybersecurity writ large, and understanding those trade-offs and understanding that decisions about design, such as leaving a redundant manual override, have a cost implication, and that was probably removed from an engineering design because of cost savings, but that it is an investment in against future security. So that's very much part of the dialogue. Critical to get to those folks, as you say, security and safety aren't just something that lower level implementers have to deal with, but the folks that are hopefully signing off on systems and taking accountability understand the risk that they're accepting in doing so.
And what you're describing is something that the CIE community could use some help on.
Yeah.
How do we make it an attractive proposition for leaders to invest in cyber-informed engineering? How do we tell that story of the return on investment for investing early on engineering to reap benefits over the long term? And it makes sense that engineers, they know how to do safety. So when things like hazards analysis is being performed, considering can that hazard be created through cyber means? In many cases, the answer is yes. And in many cases, that's a scenario that engineers haven't considered. And one thing that particularly stands out among the engineering community when they're thinking of that hazards analysis is they often don't identify those opportunities for misuse of digital systems. So there's a lot of experience with failure mode analysis and that sort of thing, but very little time and effort spent on how could somebody misuse a system to cause a catastrophic failure. And then part of the return on investment work that needs to be done is, I'd say insurance in this space is still immature. That cyber insurance typically
Property and
covers
casualty too. That's
So-
what I'm focused on.
Yes, so cyber insurance typically deals with the loss associated with breaches or ransomware, that sort of thing. But property casualty tied in with cyber insurance. I don't know anybody knows how to do that. You know, there's not an actuarial table that helps you understand what the cost of those losses are that would be perhaps covered by an insurer and perhaps not. So
you've hit upon a couple of key points. I just want to make sure to emphasize here. First of all, I share the same experience. It's when you talk to the engineering world, and I do. A lot of AE firms are in my nonprofit. The engineers don't understand that there's a risk there that they're not aware of, a human risk, a human safety risk. You talk to asset owners, and they're like, "An OT can do what?" You know, and so they don't even understand the concept of operational technologies and how that there are life supporting systems within OT that can be quickly impacted by a cybersecurity attack. So raising awareness is key in all sectors. Again, this strategy was written for the energy sector, but it can be applied in any application. But there has to be an awareness that as an asset owner, I must protect public and human safety when I'm building anything. And then I must turn to my engineering team and saying, you must help me. So you're right, raising awareness. My concern is, okay, you get a mechanical engineer and electrical engineer saying, okay, where do I learn this? Because of the fact it's happening so fast. We are adopting technology at such a rapid pace. Right now in our cars, you know, we have up to 3,000 microchips in a typical car that's built in 2023. No dashboard light that says, hey, pull over, someone's messing with your data. You no longer own your car. You share that relationship with the car manufacturer who sends firmware and software updates to your car that adjust performance without even your knowledge. So we have technology moving so quickly, the engineering world doesn't even know how to catch up. And so, I mean, what can we do in implementing this strategy to try to close that gap quickly?
So yeah, and you're just talking about, you know, regular legacy combustion vehicles, not
future.
electric vehicles. And you know, it just makes me think about the strategic opportunity, the sense of urgency that we have now in the president's budget. The astonishing figure that the budget quoted was $3.5 trillion in public spending that is coming down the pike via the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Chips and Science Act. And it's an enormous amount of public spending. Much of it is on renewing, refreshing our critical infrastructure, which often means digitizing, modernizing that infrastructure. Things like investing $7.8 billion in building out the national network of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We want to make sure we're doing that secure by design. We don't want to have to rip and replace if we find that there were backdoors or a supply chain vulnerability in that EV charging infrastructure or the EV itself. And we're talking about actual Internet of Things that are being plugged into the grid. So we really need to make sure that those things are secure, that we're addressing security as we're making those investments, as we're pushing out grants, as we're doing research in the clean energy transition. That means that we're digitizing everything. So this becomes ever more important.
And who's the we? The engineers of the world. The common set of engineers we have in this country are going to be putting together designs for all that investment.
And it really is a very broad ecosystem, and we're looking more at the ecosystem to secure these things. It's not just traditional asset owners in the energy sector or manufacturers of components or manufacturers of specialty equipment like EV charging. It's the cloud platforms that are serving up all of that. It's the integrators that are integrating new technology, new endpoint devices back into the traditional grid. Everything's being layered on top of existing infrastructure. And one of the things about certainly operational technology and control systems is the life cycle is so much longer than IT. That as we're modernizing the grid, we're modernizing building systems, we're not taking away the old system. We're most of the time layering something new on. And so that's that IT OT convergence. So how do we make sure that we're not losing something as those two pieces are coming together and we're getting great capability, and that's certainly driving the speed with which new technologies are being introduced. So how do we keep up? And the National Cyber Informed Engineering Strategy addresses all of these areas. It's got 5 different pillars. really, as Verge mentioned, looking at awareness, but also education and requirements. So we know we need to educate engineers and engineering technicians on cybersecurity basics, on how cyber can cause systems to fail, how they can design systems to be resilient against an intelligent adversary, not just hurricanes and wildfires, but an adversary that's mindfully attacking the system and continuing to attack it, and trying to get to it through cyber means. So how do we develop the education, standards, requirements that are needed to secure systems, and then how do we apply it? And so we're addressing through the full spectrum of those needs in cyber-informed engineering, to get to really moving the needle in this area.
Precisely right. And going back to those engineers, engineers aren't going to become cybersecurity specialists, but there's some foundational things they need to know and always consider about cybersecurity, because right now, those engineers and designers are banking on unverified trust that those hundreds of microchips, that those digital dependencies, that somebody else is taking care of the cybersecurity issues associated with those components, and the design engineer doesn't need to worry that. Unfortunately, there is a gap there, and so we found increasingly that bringing together the engineers, the operators, the IT
the integrators.
security, the OT security, yes, all into the same room. Oftentimes they're talking for the very first
Yep.
time. And so how do we make it normal, routine, that's a
They're talking
standard
for the first
practice?
time at 90% design complete.
Yeah.
So they're significantly through the design before they finally get together and say, okay, here's what I've designed, as opposed to working together from the very beginning.
And that's a huge point, Lucian,
Yeah.
that when you consider the product design, engineering life cycle, cybersecurity is typically brought in
Yep.
much towards
Way
the
too
end,
late.
when it would be far more effective to do it
Yep.
early in the process. And those are the sorts of things that need to be normalized for engineers and technicians, that it's taught in school, that you would not be able to get a professional engineer's license without showing competency and understanding in these cyber areas. And so cyber-informed engineering, it's like ragu, it's in there. And so if others, those engineers, were taught the 12 principles of cyber-informed engineering, we'd be well on our way to be able to turn that corner for securing infrastructure.
So as a moderator, I was given the artistic license to also participate in a discussion by you both, so I'll go ahead and use that. So from my perspective, I'm an architect. I've worked mechanicals, electricals, civils my entire life. I don't know if they have the bandwidth to be able to expand their curriculum, even at the undergraduate level or even in their professional education development, to start approaching effectively what we need to do to secure and safeguard those systems that we're putting into anything. So I'm a big believer in it, the need for a new discipline, cybersecurity engineering. There are engineering firms, universities around the country who have specific 4-year program that combines network engineering with system engineering, and then ultimately with the cybersecurity overlay. I do believe that the building disciplines need that. They need to have a separate engineer that has oversight over Division 25, which is building automation, and a couple other divisions, and work side by side with the electricals and mechanicals, and ensure that the network plans that they're importing into anything, whether it be a vehicle, whether it be an airplane or a building, that they are solely responsible, licensed engineers, stamped by states or approved by states, to be able to stamp drawings for cyber safety and any design, and take that load off that mechanical or that electrical, who has to worry about the safety of their systems. We're not quite there yet. Is that something you could see evolving from the community practice and the strategy?
Yeah, definitely. I think, certainly as we've been talking, and I know I've been talking to engineering faculty for, better than a decade, dealing with changing curricula at the university level is always a very, tough rock because, curricula's full, you can't mess with accreditation, don't have any more room for anything new. So we're approaching this through cyber-informed engineering, what we're implementing from two different ways. We've got a couple of universities that have fielded classes that are solely about cyber-informed engineering. Shout out to Singmin Liu from Boise State, who has the honor of giving the first cyber-informed engineering class last summer to really try to see what could we do with a whole class format just in this topic, applying cyber to engineering. But we're really also looking at how do we infuse cyber-informed engineering concepts throughout existing curricula. We know we're not going to pack in more, so how do we work and infuse that? And so developing a body of knowledge that can be provided and shared with universities, with engineering faculty. We're developing that, certainly an area of interest to both get at driving across, driving specific classes. I think both ways are going to help, but hopefully getting to educational requirements. I know I've had discussions for the federal side. We have a lot of work supporting cybersecurity education through Scholarship for Service and the Centers for Academic Excellence. I would really love to have a Center of Academic Excellence for control systems engineers and cybersecurity so that we can support that from the federal side. So there's a lot of different specifics that we're driving towards in our education pillar, and looking for more ideas too from the audience of, hey, we know we need to do this. What's the best way we can, layering it onto existing formats?
And so while I applaud that the idea of a specialist in cybersecurity engineering, it's once again not sufficient that somehow that concept of cybersecurity needs to be baked into every engineering discipline. And so just in the way that safety is, that there are specialist safety engineers in all other disciplines know they shouldn't design an inherently dangerous component or system or widget. And so that same sort of thinking needs to be among those engineers for cyber. If they are designing a component, a system that has a digital dependency, are they trusting that digital component to not be able to cause a high consequence events, a catastrophic failure, a loss of functionality? And is there a way that they could design their system to eliminate that digital dependency, or to be prepared that that digital dependency is going to give the wrong, the worst possible command to the physical side? And so every engineer needs to be able to think that way, whether it's electrical, civil, fill in.
Yeah, and again, and this is, I think, probably a great opportunity for future discussion on that, because and when I've talked to engineers, the way that technology is advancing, not just in mechanical systems in a building, but what other technology is being brought into a building. A mechanical engineer doesn't necessarily know what AV or what other capabilities are brought in that potentially can create a threat. And they're all going to be tied in through either wireless or wired networks. And so you did see coming out of building safety, a unique profession in a PE dedicated to fire control safety. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we didn't have a fire control engineer or fire protection engineer. Now you have that sitting next to mechanical and electrical to ensure that you've got fire protection. I think something similar, particularly with as we are wiring out and adding technologies to everything we're doing, more chips, more controls. It's tough for
more sensors.
More sensors. It's tough for that mechanical, electrical to stay on top of that. If you were to turn that over to a cybersecurity engineer that's a licensed professional engineer with statutory or code requirements to be able to adhere, that cybersecurity engineer could bring together that network, bring together that backnet for building systems, and work next to the mechanical, electrical, and say, okay, I've got this. I have a cybersecurity background. I know what sensors, what software, what we need to spec in to go ahead and ensure your wireless remote, or your wireless access to your MEC system doesn't create a risk for the rest of the building. Zones and conduits, mechanical engineers aren't necessarily brought up on, how do you segment networks? How do you segment create zones and layers. That's what the cybersecurity engineer would do. So I think that's probably, a good discussion for the community of practice. I'm a firm believer in we can't ask mechanicals and electricals to add to their knowledge base. They need to focus on the safety requirements for the systems they're putting in.
I think the answer is ultimately going to be both. I agree with you. I think I could easily see evolving a special kind of engineer that's just cybersecurity focused and how these systems interconnect and their interdependencies. That's going to take a little while.
Yep.
But I also agree that all kinds of engineers need basic fundamentals in how does cybersecurity, how does automation, how do sensors and data really impact the work that you're doing. And so I think ultimately the answer is both. We have had some discussions with PE certification. Adding something to PE certification again is a long process. I think ultimately that is a goal we want to aim towards. Maybe the decade time frame. But yeah, it's sad but true. So what can we do now, just from the awareness, education, broadly getting to all of everybody while we pursue a more formal, professionalized engineer in this area? We've been talking about professionalizing cybersecurity for a long time, and I think this might be one way, because engineers have this professional certification process, could be one way of getting to a more professionalized discipline of cybersecurity in this area. So I think it's a good goal. I just know that those kinds of things take a long time.
Yep, they do. There's no doubt about it.
And I could see all engineering disciplines being educated enough in cyber to know when they have to ask the specialist. So just like someone designing a building has a concept that wood may be more flammable than concrete. And so if I'm making that design decision, maybe I should talk to the fire specialist to help me out with that part. Right now, that typically does not happen with cyber considerations, that it's not even considered until late in that development cycle, as you were saying earlier. So,
okay, so moving on from the requirements phase and what an engineer needs to do, where I see the next step for us to work on with the community of practice in the future, and I'll get that in a moment. How do engineers translate requirements to those who are building and integrating? So to ensure that what they have worked on in the design process ultimately is carried through, to include a cyber commissioning, a concept that has never really been discussed in the past, but now is starting to take hold. How do you cyber commission a building or cyber commission an asset? So talk to me a little bit about what you see in the strategy, and ultimately how do you translate engineering into implementation and operation?
So I think really important for engineers is tooling. And we do have a developmental pillar in the strategy that really focuses on what are the tools that engineers need to be able to apply cyber to the work that they're doing, and how can we, as a community, create those tools, create the research needed to support that, and make those tools as broadly available as possible to the community. So I think that's definitely a key focus area.
and so over that entire life cycle, while individuals may specialize in a given step, everyone along that continuum needs to have cyber awareness, perhaps to the level of knowing when to call the specialist, perhaps at the level that they have expertise in a given area. So every point from requirements definition to where are the components going to be sourced? Are there supply chain issues associated with that? How are they going to be manufactured? How are they going to be integrated? For those doing the integration, are they relying on outsourced components or personnel? And how is that potentially going to affect confidence in the cybersecurity of that system? And then it's through operations, how are those systems being maintained? When someone has hands on the system, are there controls in place to make sure that no alterations are made? So it's soup to nuts.
How are you going to handle the data associated with the system?
Very much so.
Part of digitizing critical infrastructure, particularly physical infrastructure, is censoring. We've done a lot of work, certainly post-Colonial pipeline, in trying to increase the sensor viewing, the sensor view of critical infrastructure from the grid to pipelines to water systems. That's been a national priority, but sensoring means data. And buildings now collect a lot of data, and it could be data about who's in the room. It could be data from built-in cameras,
Mhm.
other things. So how do you protect, how do you limit the collection of data to just what's needed to provide operation for that particular system? And then what is your data handling policy? How do you collect it? How do you protect it? When do you, for how long? I don't think most engineers think about data
Nope.
handling as part of their business, but it is now in our increasingly censored world.
I'm going to throw a little bit of a sidebar here, and actually it's more of a plug. The future for me is digital twins. As you are looking at any design of any system, I think there has to be a requirement by the owner that I want delivered to me a digital twin at some place where I can capture and look at that data. Now it can be in a compartmentalized situation, but that digital twin offers you the ability to engineer in and ultimately track building performance,
Mhm.
track what you spec'd, see if it's operating the way you spec'd it, and running it. Do you see a growing? I do, but wants to get your perspective on the growing need for much more sophisticated digital twinning than we're seeing right now.
I think absolutely, and certainly as we are connecting everything in our Internet of Things connected world, our future IT OT integrated world, these systems are becoming ever more complex, ever more things connected, and the only way to really understand what is to have visibility in your ecosystem, what's there, and as a beginning to understand the dependencies for everything like supply chain analysis to cyber incident response. I think we're going to see more and more digital twin technology really become a necessary factor for secure and safe operation.
Of course,
Yeah.
I'm from Idaho National
I know you
Labs,
are.
so I
was trying to set
believe
you up
in
with that question.
Okay, so everything from modeling and simulation through benchtop and scale models to emulation to digital twins to full scale replication of systems. I think every one of those is a capability that is needed, and whether it's applied to a given system is situational. Digital twins, I think, will become much more commonplace. There will be times when things need to be tested and demonstrated at full scale. That's why Idaho National Lab, 890 square miles of space that hosts stuff and equipment that can be experimented with and demonstrations occur. If that can be done that demonstration can be done on a digital twin, that's almost assuredly more cost effective and more adaptable to situational issues and changes. So yes, I think there's
No worries. I knew we'd
there's
get
a
agreement on that one.
there's a future there.
So I do want to make sure I got time for audience questions, but I got to ask, so hands up if anybody wants to ask a question, but I got one more question. Great strategy, what now? I know you're working on a community of practice. Can you give a little more detail where you would like to, particularly in your role in the White House and at the lab, where do you want to take this as far as implementation?
So great question. Thanks for that. Of course, this strategy has been published for a little less than a year now. We've been looking at, okay, how do we implement now, having laid out these principles, having laid out a 5-pillar approach that covers awareness, education, development of tools and research, and then applied uses to both legacy and new technology. What do we do about that? And the great news is we have a developing and robust set of partners that have already been working on implementation efforts. To me, my favorite implementation story comes from Idaho National Labs, that the first new generation, I want to say generation 4 nuclear microgrid technology that's being pioneered for the Department of Defense by Idaho National Labs and a consortium of different companies. It's sponsored also by the Department of Energy. This new technology for nuclear microgrids is being built with CIE principles. So of course we want our nuclear secure by design, and I'm glad to see that Idaho has taken the opportunity of this new really game-changing technology for the Department of Defense and used it as a key example of how we can build cybersecurity in at the ground level for systems. As I mentioned, we have a number of educational partners from Boise State to University of Texas, San Antonio, Auburn University that have also agreed to help infuse cyber-informed engineering into their engineering curricula. They're working actively with their faculty to see how can we make this work? How can we layer it in to existing curricula? And we also have industry partners that are taking cyber-informed engineering and implementing it. We've worked with a water company that has already used cyber-informed engineering in designing water systems. I won't necessarily name the company, but they've already used this to make design trade-offs in building new water systems. We know after the Oldsmar example in Florida that water systems are yet another thing we need to make sure we're securing in the cyber security sense. So it's great to see that the community is already coalescing around this strategy, and we have some very specific implementation examples that are already in process. But of course, we want to do more. And as we've talked about this morning, there are a lot of longer term things here. If I want to have a cyber Center of Academic Excellence for Control Systems Engineers, that's a 10-year program. Changing PE certification or professionalizing cyber engineers, that's maybe a 10-year timeline. So, we definitely want to start down the road for some of those longer term things, but it's great to see some existing activities already being taken up by the community. And industry partners, both manufacturers, asset owners, are really getting behind this.
And so while that national strategy is relatively new, the concepts behind cyber-informed engineering have been around for a while. And Idaho National Lab has an implementation of CIE that we call consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, CCE for short. And with that process, we go through 4 phases. Step 1 is consequence prioritization, identifying those worst case scenarios that should be not allowed to.
Yep, life,
to
safety,
happen.
health probably is top of the list, right?
Yep, very much. And then the second step is a systems of systems analysis. That's learning everything that's possible from published information, available information about the system. And then the third step is consequence-based targeting. All through these steps, the goal is to think like the adversary. How would an adversary be approaching that system to cause that high consequence event, that worst case scenario? And then finally, after doing all of that work, the fourth step is mitigations and protections, making those changes that are encouraged by cyber-informed engineering to ideally completely eliminate the cyber risk. So I'll give you a brief example. We've got time here. So in one of the early CCE engagements we did at a utility in a combined cycle plant, there's water that's used. And so the pH of that water needs to be maintained and the water quality maintained. And so one of the scenarios considered a high consequence event would be, can you alter that water so that it would corrode out the system and be harmful? And so in working with the operator for that system, they said, yes, that would be a bad thing. We call that overdoping, except that it can't happen here because all the chemicals I have are in this 10-gallon container. And so, yes, an adversary could potentially gain access to the digital controller, say, push all the chemicals out. That would be bad, but not catastrophic. However, if it happened to be twice that volume and pushed 20 gallons out, that would be catastrophic. So the simple cyber-informed engineering solution there was write the policy to never let that tank be more than 10 gallons. And so just that simple change completely eliminated the potential cyber risk, so that if somebody did all the work to gain access to that digital controller, did all the work to develop the knowledge to attack, it wouldn't produce the desired effect, because there's a physical control, an engineered control that considered that cyber risk.
Yep.
And so you can think of other engineering solutions you could do in that sort of a scenario. Instead of having a limit on the volume of the tank of chemicals, you could have a limit on the size of the pipe that's able to squirt those chemicals in. And so once again, an engineering solution that completely eliminates the cyber risk.
That's right.
So,
But those kind of decisions happen at the design level.
Right.
Right, early
One can
on.
retrofit, but
you can
often,
fix it, but it's often a physical change, and physical changes are easier early in the process. So for consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, we offer training in that area. There's a website you can learn on your own. There's a 2-day course called Accelerate, where we teach others how to conduct the process, give them materials to go off and do it on their own. We from INL do CCE engagements on a very limited basis for government sponsors, but we have licensed the approach, and there are 6 licensees now that you can go out and work with to do CCE on systems that you own and operate. So an implementation of CIE that's out there working today.
Yep. Hey, I'm going to ask Bryson's dream question here in a minute. Hang on. So I want to give you a minute. I just want to make sure are there any audience questions?
oh, yes.
Ken.
Sure. So I'm glad you said that sort of listening, and again, definitely not a new concept, right? Oh, sure. So I'm glad you said that sort of the end. Definitely not a new concept, but I'm glad to see we have sort of this national strategy around it to complement what we're doing from a national cybersecurity strategy perspective. So my question really for you guys is, as an asset owner, right? We have huge brownfield problems. You're not going to fix the engineer's problem in the next decade. You're not going to replace some of these control systems in the next decade. So what can I do in the near term as an asset owner, right, to help influence CIE in the context of the requirements that I'm putting in for projects and things like that, whether it be Division 25 or other mechanisms that would be on your radar, so that we can help sort of force the function to happen, right? They may not be educated, they may not be aware, but I'm going to force them through the requirements that I'm putting in to become more cyber aware.
By the way, if you don't know, that's Ken Kurtz, CTO of COPT, and a former NSA, probably one of the smartest guys in this industry looking at this right now. So
Good. Well, I'm glad we have your attention. So I think, as Verge said, as we're looking at addressing legacy systems, taking the CCE approach, kind of the red team approach, to how would you break your current system, and then use that understanding to mitigate and make changes. Certainly, we're also looking and very focused on introducing principles for new technology, for new and emerging technology, new builds. As I said, we're focused on the national network of EV charging infrastructure. That's new infrastructure, and introducing cybersecurity into the requirements as we're handing out federal grants to state departments of transportation to build that out. How can we ensure that they're including cybersecurity in their requirements, in their design? So we're definitely focused on, because we have all of this investment in new infrastructure and modernizing infrastructure. First up is how do we get it into the money? How do we get it into BIL grant requirements? How do we get it into IRA grant requirements? So that's certainly a focus for the White House to just get cybersecurity in there, because if it's not If it's not in the grant, if it's not in the contracts, it will not happen organically. So that's been the sense, that's been our urgent, immediate step.
So as an owner operator, I'd say within your neck of the woods, if I were to do one thing, it would be get together the team that can make a difference. Get the engineers, the operators, the IT staff, the OT staff, all together in the same room, just considering cybersecurity together. Oftentimes that's not done. If you want to shape what CIE becomes, there's a community of practice. So that community practice right now comprises 3 working groups, one specifically on implementation, one on education and training, and another on tools. And so,
Standards.
thank you. And that is open to all of us to join. If you go to INL, that's Idaho National Lab, inl.gov/CIE, there will be plenty of information there, along with a button to click on to join the community of practice.
Yeah.
So please.
But Ken hits a good point, and I know we haven't run out of time, but we're looking at implementation, the COP, we have to look at brown versus green. It's like you mentioned, trillions of dollars of infrastructure for green development, but the brownfield is ultimately where it might come up and bite us right now. So that's something, as we're looking at a guidance going out for both green and brown, we have to address the unique aspects of having to retrofit cyber into existing infrastructure. So Ken, I really do appreciate that question. Real quick question, and we are running low on time, and I want to give him a chance to close out.
Real quickly, from a policy standpoint, when regulators come out with new requirements, new in our industry, which is water, that policy often drives technology, which often has to inform design characteristics, say for existing or new facilities. What conversations are going on between the policymakers, and then how does that filter down to implementation when it comes to doing things like CIE? Because there's a lot of things that we can do in the water industry. However, there are things that we can't do. You know, if you ask me to run a sophisticated wastewater treatment plant manually, probably not going to happen because we're relying on technology. And in order to get to that level of CIE that we all want to get to, that CIE becomes a direct contrast to value engineering.
Yep.
And there's a balance that needs to be struck here. So there's a lot of things that have to take place and a lot of different conversations at various levels in order to make this happen.
So before you answer, remember this is a loaded issue because the EPA has recently issued guidance.
Yep.
That the water industry, through their associations, are pushing back pretty rigorously on, and saying it's not implementable, through sanitation surveys. So,
Well, I think as you say, these are complex and continuing questions. And I will say that certainly at the policy level, we are looking at, and this administration has made policy statements that we need to get to better baseline cybersecurity. And we are intending to do that through additional regulation. We are ameliorating that by talking about regulatory harmonization, that we want to ensure that, providers of technology have an easier path to provide, to address and adhere to regulations across that apply to different critical infrastructure sectors. So regulation, of course, requires standards alignment. There are multiple conversations happening in this area, but these are complex issues. So yeah, this is definitely being addressed at the policy level. This is a policy goal.
So when I get that from Bryson, that's not
Yes.
a good thing, because of the fact I feel like I got a red dot right on my forehead. 30 seconds on each on what you would like to see, your dream for CIE in 5 or 6 years.
It's widespread, it's implemented, it's commonplace.
Yep.
I think tools and examples of implementation, the best way to get more is to have good examples to show people the way.
And then for me, every engineer understands that they have a safety responsibility to address cybersecurity and cyber safety in their designs. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Great talking to you all, and please
Thanks so
join
much.
us. Join the committee of practice if you're interested in following up on this. So
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
most of it out. I appreciate it. Yeah. Here.
So I think this is the first panel we've had where they're not wearing jackets and long sleeve shirts. I think we're about to get real and get technical. Information overload, exclamation point. What's actually happening and what matters most for OT defense? As organizations that own and operate industrial control and operational technology environments have continued to learn more about threats to their most valued assets, they continued to make significant investments in cybersecurity resources for defending them. The avalanche amount of information coming from governments, media, solution providers, and internal tools, technologies, and resources is overwhelming. This panel discussion will provide perspectives and insight from individuals in different roles protecting their critical assets. They will share what information and resources are useful in helping defenders turn information and technology into actionable defense. The panel will be moderated by Jeff Jones, who is the director of Sci-Fi for Cyber Physical Industrial Control Systems at GRIM. Jeff is passionate about securing our nation's critical infrastructures. He's the director of Cyber Physical Engineering and ICS at GRIM, an innovative, forward-looking cybersecurity organization. Jeff has spent over 21 years in information and cybersecurity risk management with particular expertise in industrial control and operational technology, system cybersecurity. He spent 13 of those years at one of the largest electricity providers in the US, holding several different positions in their industry-leading cybersecurity organizations. I think Jeff plays a pretty mean guitar too.
I try. Thank you. Go Navy.
We're actually supposed to sit under our pictures.
You boys are sitting in the middle.
Here.
Camera loves you.
Huh?
The camera loves you.
Oh, yeah, it's fine. First, thank you, Bryson, for the welcome, and I want to thank MITRE for hosting us and Hactic Capital for the opportunity to speak with everybody today. I'm absolutely honored to be sitting here with these three talented and experienced individuals. Like Bryson said, in my 21 years plus in cybersecurity, I've had the privilege of working in many different environments and on a lot of challenging issues in different spaces. I've been looking back on the last 5 years, which kind of gave me the idea for this talk. I've observed network defenders and folks in the ICS space gravitate from when I first joined the electricity ISAC about 6 years ago to wanting all the information. I want all the IOCs. I want all the data. I want all the information that I can get about these systems. And over the last 5 years, I've been looking back and kind of seeing a shift in folks saying, I'm starting to drown in information. What really matters? What can I implement today? What am I really looking for as far as alerts and technology? So that's what this talk is about. And I hope that you'll take away from these individuals that are up here with me, some things that you can put to work in your organizations and when you're thinking about risk to your system. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Gilson from Dragos. So if you guys could introduce each or yourselves, we'll get into it.
Sure. Jim Gilson, I'm technical leader at Dragos. I've been here for 3.5, almost 4 years. I basically concentrate on like architecture reviews, maturity assessments, risk assessments, things like that. I've been a consultant for over 10, and previous to that, I was with NIST for 20 years in the engineering lab. I was also the co-chair of the ISA 99 committee developing 62443 between 2012 and 2022. So.
Ken Kurz.
Okay, Ken Kurz from COPT. Again, thanks to MITRE for hosting this. I'm the CIO for Corporate Office Properties Trust. We are a defense IT-oriented REIT headquartered out of Columbia, Maryland. We lease a ton of space to Department of Defense, defense contractors, three-letter agencies, and the like. My career has been active duty Navy, NSA, CISO for a couple of research universities, worked in the nonprofit world for a little while, and have been at COPT for about 7-8 years now. really heavily focused on control system space as an asset owner operator on the built environment side, the demand side of critical infrastructure, and doing a lot of work there.
Thank you. And Mr. Carlo Castaneda.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Matt, as well, for hosting us. I'm an independent contractor right now. I'm on my part-time. Most of the time, I'm just taking it to myself right now. Before that, I used to be at the ARC, which focused on systemic risks for energy and financial companies. Before that, I was also at the Pentagon and then at Electricity ISAC, where I had the pleasure of meeting Jeff there. Most of my work has been on trying to make sure that we get the glue between the different companies and different agencies that have different interests to try to protect those critical assets. So it's complicated. I'll just leave it at that because it's hard to explain.
Excellent. So I'm going to speak in a few generalizations here. My questions and some points are gathered from talking to and collaborating with others in the OT community, the ICS security community. And obviously every organization is different, has different prioritizations and risk tolerances for systems. And I'm going to turn this over to you gentlemen here in a second. But I think it's worth starting with talking about fundamentals. We hear all the time that you can't protect and defend what you don't know that you have. So I want to talk about, to kick it off, what the importance for a defender of knowing what systems are critical. I think this is always a starting point, but definitely a not easy starting point in the OT world. 3 key points here: asset inventory, network diagrams, and process and data flows. And Ken, when we were talking about prepping for this panel, I'd like to kick it off with you because you kind of talked about, a complete lack thereof at some situations of those 3 key points. So, from an information perspective, what is important as a starting point? What do you need to know instead of drowning yourself in everything that you have?
Yeah, so the example we were talking about was a data center that we used to own. When we walked in, they were looking for some help from an IT perspective for the backbone in the building. And when we got there, we found everything was unmanaged switches, everything was on the same VLAN, all the critical systems were all networked together. Really, their idea of network segmentation was a different third octet in the IP scheme, and no controls, really. Asked them for documentation, didn't exist, and so on. So I think really starting out, probably the most important thing is getting visibility on what there is. It's not even what's critical. It's going to be really like what is connected to this environment. And then physically, where is it located in the building? And then you can start to work your way through, how is it configured and so on. Because again, it was an operational environment that can't go down. You can't really mess with it. You really have to do things in a very passive way, which took an enormous amount of time to ensure that we weren't being disruptive. But at the same time, flipping the wrong bit could have taken the whole system down very, very easily. So yeah, it all goes back to the things we've talked about for years, knowing what you have so that you can know what to defend.
How about you from, the work that Dragos does in the fields, both in incident response and also obviously in the technology space for asset identification? What's important?
Asset identification, finding out what you have on the systems is really important. Now, one thing I will say is that getting to that 100% level on your asset inventory is extremely difficult. Moving from getting 80, 90% to that 100% can take an inordinate amount of time. So at least starting with, get a quick view of everything you can, as quick as you can, to at least start to getting your handle around what's there. Then work on building out that rest as you can so that you can understand all the little bits that may or may not show up all the time. I mean, if you're doing network analysis, you're going to see things that appear for the most time, but there's always going to be something that's event-driven that may not talk when you happen to be listening. So you may have to spend some time really looking for that. You may have to do walk downs of your entire facility, literally looking at every port, pulling wires, making sure everything tracing wires, not pulling wires. Don't do that. But yeah, so really looking around to find everything that's there. Summer students are really good for that. Interns, summer students, fresh outs, things like that. Having them go and learn the systems because they're learning what's there, what's not. And they can start to get a feel for what's there in the environment.
And I found that talking to, the system owners, the engineers, from a crown jewel analysis per se type of perspective, you end up, and I heard somebody say it earlier in one of the talks, these types of environments end up being systems of systems assessment. You look at, without this, piece of equipment, without this PLC, without this switch, we can't keep the lights on, we can't make our widget, we can't do whatever it is we need to do. And then you walk back from there. What are the supporting technologies that are connected to that process or that piece of equipment that without it, you're out of luck? How about you, Carlo?
I mean, I think that they've brought up a lot of really good points to start with. I would say look at where you're starting from and then see who are the connecting pieces that would match really well with that would strengthen your weaknesses. So something that you mentioned, having folks who are new and really eager to learn to be able to go there and look for those things. They also have more time usually, right? I would say also look at the folks in accounting. They usually know where the bills are being paid and they'll be able to give you a point of view that maybe you won't be able to have at your level if you're coming from the IT side, if you're new to OT, or if you're in the operator. But I think those three groups, the people that pay the bills, the people that are responsible for that process in the business, and the people that are operating them or engineering them, having those folks all together is a very powerful way to understand where those places are.
Yeah, I think paying the bills is a great point we didn't talk about ahead of time, right? We ended up saving over 7 figures on an annual basis when we sat down with the accountants and started looking at where our telecom spend was going, right? And then from a cyber risk perspective, what we found was that you'd have a particular building that would have 6, 7, 8 different internet connections, one for each system, and everything is directly exposed to the internet. And so when we started understanding what we're paying for,
Sure.
we got the cost savings, we got the risk reduction from something very simple as finding rogue broadband connections that integrators had hooked up to provide themselves remote access to systems.
Absolutely. And how about, you encounter network diagrams, that are dated, that have, that shouldn't be evolving in some of these environments, but they change over time. Sitting down with the individuals and walking through those together. I mean, is there an opinion on the value of that? Because I mean, what I'm hearing from folks, especially over the last year, catching up with folks in conferences, how important that the accuracy of those diagrams are, and just validating that with the system owners, with the folks that are working on it every day to make sure that they're up to date. Because when you have a company come in that might do a third-party assessment, or heaven forbid, you're in the heat of an incident, inaccuracies in that, when folks all need to kind of get in the war room and get at the table and start looking at, the connectivity of the systems and where things are located, when that's out of date, you really have a challenge.
Yeah, I run into that a lot of times in doing assessments, where we'll walk in and maybe they have the like line diagrams, the AutoCAD line diagrams that show all the electrical systems. They'll show where everything's like physically plugged in. Oh, it goes from this wire to this patch panel to this switch over here, things like that. But then to trace down some of the wires, you got to like look across 5 different diagrams. They don't have those viewpoints of the network from an architecture point of view. They have the physical electrical wiring of how things are done. And sometimes tracing down how those systems are connected and what really the architecture of the system can be difficult to follow. But then also kind of goes along with the asset view too of saying, okay, what's plugged in where? Sometimes they won't have all of that documented in those diagrams, or like projects come through and they may not go through and identify all the changes that are made. Usually their change management from a process point of view is really good, but sometimes from the networking and computer side, they're not as good documenting those kind of changes into some of the backing that into the architecture.
Agreed. So the key point is, you would think that this is, obvious fundamentals, but the fundamentals of those 3 tenets, the accuracy and current up-to-dateness of your inventory, your diagrams, and your process flows, it just can't be overstated. And experience from the field shows that in many times they're not up to date, even though you think they are. So that's a key point to take away here. I'd like to move on to talking about, we've evolved away from, especially in the OT world, move beyond prevention and the value of detections and accurate detections in these environments when you're talking about technology and processes and alerting has become much more valuable, obviously, in the world today and against the threats that we're facing. So without getting into too much technical inertia, I'd like to talk about what makes a high value detection when you're talking about alerting tools. Properly configured devices is obviously a starting point to make sure that when you're getting information from a detection tool, that it is valuable and it's not just noise to you. What data, and Jim, I'll start with you here, what data makes detections high value? How do we get valuable intelligence from our detections?
That kind of goes along with what we were talking about before, understanding your systems, understanding what's there, knowing how those systems are used and what the risks they potentially might have in your environment. So if you know that this one system is critical to the operations, maybe it's your burner management system or something like that, you know that that system, if you start to get any kind of detections around that system, that you need to be much more concerned than, say, just something that's monitoring air quality that can go down, and or you've got like 5 of those in an area, and you're getting detections on all of them. If one of them goes down, it's not as important. But if that burner management system goes down, you then got to start looking at the risk. So you start looking at, you were talking crown jewels earlier, identifying those crown jewels, identifying ways that an attacker could get to those. And then you start looking at what kind of detections would you want to start noticing. And that way you can identify, okay, this event is more important to your overall system, the risk to your system, and you can prioritize that one over the 10,000 firewall hits you get from Conficker or whatever going on. So.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm glad you said, that's where I really wanted to drill into is, how do we think about prioritization of these types of alerts? So Ken, from your experience and what would you, especially from the CISO level, what are you looking for? What kind of metrics are you looking for from these types of technologies and people?
Yeah, I think one of the really important points and perspectives, and Bryson brought it up sort of as a throwaway comment earlier, but it was, how do we get left of boom?
Yep.
Right? And as far to the left with respect to early in the attack chain, the alerts that are going to provide me value for somebody who may have gained access and is trying to establish persistence before they can get to, say, the burners, right? Or to that piece of critical infrastructure that is running the building. I think my perspective is really if we're detecting something that's that far down, I've got a huge problem beyond whatever that thing is that may be affected. And so we've spent a lot of time and energy around how do I gain visibility, awareness, intelligence around how an adversary would likely gain access, establish persistence, be able to assess sort of where they're at in the network, so that if we do have somebody who is looking at the control system side of our infrastructure, that we have a better chance at stopping them before they've been able to put physical effects on a device that's somewhere downstream. I think metrics have always been a very difficult thing, right? I mean, we talk about 10,000 hits on a firewall. It really doesn't tell the story. I think we're really interested in things that are more outcome-based than audit-based, right? And are we doing the right things from the standpoint of preparing the organization, looking at, have we done tabletop exercises? Have we done our training? Have we, thought through how an adversary would, work its way through the system, and how have we layered our defenses and that sort of thing, more so. And that's what our board is interested in, more so than, here's the 20 things on a red, yellow, green chart.
I'm glad you said that, because I was just going to ask Carlo about this, moving into it, thinking like a malicious actor, what business or environmental, physical, cyber information would give a better understanding to somebody making decisions, or somebody correlating information, sharing information, to cause thinking of a change in the risk profile or a change in your risk appetite. So, from your perspective, especially in the sharing space of all the years that you spent there, what data to answer those questions, or what gaps the companies are talking about having, blind spots, people and processes. What is it that is needed to really would raise hackles or change a thinking in the risk profile?
Well, thanks, Jeff. I'll say something that I think that people have been in the industry for a little while, have heard this before, but maybe for the new folks is the most valuable information you're going to find within your organization, and then you're going to have gaps within that information. That is probably a good idea to make those partnerships and have those contacts outside of the organization that'll help you understand what's going on in the threat landscape or what have you. The government is a good partner for that. Other folks that are in your sector or other folks that have similar equipment as you would be good partners. Also, some of your partners, if you have a retainership with somebody else who does threat intelligence, right? That would be somebody to also discuss if they see things that may be relevant to you. When it comes to what information in particular, I would say that really depends on the kind of information you can get from within, and that goes back to what you were discussing about what would be of value there, right? I would say it's as you were talking, I was taking some notes here. Metrics is really hard, right? Once you know you have your metrics and you see if you can fulfill them internally. If you can't, then you need to go outside to get that information, right? Metrics not only for the people where the road meets the road, but also folks that are higher up who need to have those financial returns on investment for those things that they're putting in there. Critical processes, you have to be able to make sure you protect those, right? So make sure you have visibility into that, right? Having intelligence on what adversaries are able to do if they get in there, whether intentionally or otherwise, right? Because not every event is going to be something that was intentional, but having that visibility to see what's going to happen there. And unscheduled downtimes is something that you want to definitely discuss with your operators, right? What actions could cause an unscheduled downtime?
Yeah.
Because somebody, if we're looking at it the way it's actually built out, somebody at tier 1 or tier 2 of a SOC or somebody who is ever watching what's going on in the environment is not going to know necessarily what's critical, and it's really not for them to know, right? They need to really make those contacts, reach out to those operators, those engineers, and have a discussion like, hey, I'm seeing this activity. I don't know if it's weird or not, but at least I have that relationship that I can reach out to you because you, the operator, know really well if this is going to impact us or if this is just going to be something that's going to be a headache for the next 2 hours and then move on.
Right. So that's a great segue into the next topic I wanted to bring up. We were talking about, to get high value detections, that's dependent in part on, obviously, on a well architected network that we already covered. But let's talk about network segmentation and OT specifically. We hear from incident responders and all of the case studies that have been done in the high visibility intrusions with impacts. How important, we hear the abuse of the weak IT-OT border, the north-south border, but how important is network segmentation east-west? Tips, lessons learned from the field, because again, this talk is about getting the right information, the folks in this room, the folks that are going to watch us online. What are you looking for in segmentation to really help? Is a model, you talked about your experience with ISA, which is perfect, is a model, a framework like what ISA has, Purdue models, have they evolved in your experience, and is that the right approach as far as practicality?
So you mentioned Purdue.
Sure.
Purdue, from a theoretical point of view, is a data flow model.
Yep.
And from that point of view, you can still use it. People have said Purdue's dead and everything like that because of IoT and a lot of this other technology. If you take and map Purdue directly to a network model, yes, it doesn't work, and a lot of the newer technology breaks it. But if you take a look at it's just data flows and you're understanding how things move around your system, it still makes sense. From a segmentation point of view, taking that and working with it in Purdue, you start getting into things like being able to create zones and conduits within your environment. And we have found it very valuable to have those zones within customer environments. First of all, from just a simple performance point of view,
Sure.
not having big, huge, flat networks, the systems perform a lot better. If you can get them down into smaller zones, smaller systems, /24, like going even lower than that, you can start to really help the performance of how the systems, and you can start to identify where, like, who needs to talk to each other, why do they need to talk, and you can start limiting that. That will then help you to limit the spread of anything within an environment.
Sure.
And that spread doesn't even have to be malicious. It could just literally be a network card going bad in something that causes a broadcast storm, and you end up with performance problems. So it helps you from the reliability point of view. It helps you from a containability point of view. And then also even just doing any sort of response activity, you can then start to say, okay, can I run in maybe a degraded mode if this system goes offline? Can I at least produce something? It may not be as high quality, it may not be as much volume or whatever, but can I still limp along if I had to shut down this system during an operation? And so being able to sort of limit how how big your networks are within your environment helps you to start doing that, and then mapping that to your normal actual like environment system. So having those zones logically drawn out and described in ways that make sense to your operations at the plant, that also makes it similar too. So you can say, okay, I need to shut down train one, or I need to shut down this, and having your network architecture and your zone structure sort of defined around that physical plant environment.
I got in a conversation with some folks at the ICS Summit last week about that, doing that hardware is obviously via hardware is obviously the ideal approach there. But what about VLANing? Like, so, because VLANing in a critical environment, if you have a failure in the device that controls the VLANing, we have bigger problems. Is there any advice there from anybody?
So I was thinking about that. I've actually had a draft email sitting in my box for a while that I was looking at the Div 25 updates that have come out, and they're talking about VLANing in a specific conversation about VLANing, right? So one of the things that I think it's lost in there is that a VLAN is not a security control, right? And it was coming across that way in the documentation with respect to, if you do this, it will protect you in some way. And I think that the idea of zoning and access control lists and things like that, and sort of is really where we talk a lot about IT and OT culture and things like that. But I do think from a skill set perspective, where IT folks who have done that work can really help bring that to the table and leverage hey, we're going to give you better performance. We're going to give you high availability and those sorts of things with respect to how we're architecting this network. Don't get caught up in where we're putting in access control lists and we're going to lock things down. We'll take that as the IT security, the security side win of that conversation. And so, I think whether it's VLANs or other elements within the infrastructure, from an IT standpoint, it's we just have to provide better clarity on what's a control and what is more of a design organization, like how we think about the network topology.
If I can jump in, I'll just actually talk about the human factor in all this and I've been thinking about this the past few weeks, is a lot of the friction that I see there is about ownership. Right? Operators have been very comfortable and very used to, for decades, maybe longer, of owning their stuff and having IT at an arm's length. And vice versa, IT on the corporate side are very used to being owners of their equipment. And when you have these two groups that are very much have their own field, and then they're having to share that ownership, that's where I see a lot of the friction. So having that space to be able to have that conversation, because operators are going to have a very hard time giving up that ownership, because they feel so responsible for those critical processes for the company to continue to do business. Right? IT mistakes may cost you data, but they're not going to cost your lives. Right. So it's one of those things that is having that open conversation about that, and being able to find some happy medium, like you said. And I agree, like VLAN is not security, but the reality is some ICS systems are starting to become virtualized. Right.
Absolutely.
So whether we like to or not, we need to understand that this is maybe not the company you're in now, but if you decide to go somewhere else, you need to be as a professional to understand that you're going to have to learn this, because this is coming down the pipe. Maybe your company decides not to make the transition, but ultimately money talks, and that transition may be made either now or 10 years from now, because that's really where things are going.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the people component, because we're going to close with that, because the value of that collaboration just can't be understated. So we'll definitely get back to that. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna agree that I have. It used to be when I first got into this, there was actually a lot of animosity between IT and OT. I've seen a lot better reactions recently.
Same.
There's been a lot more understanding that as more of the IT style technology has moved its way into the OT environment, like you said, virtualization, servers, like all of that has moved it farther down. There's been just a more collaborative environment between IT and OT, because there's understanding that they don't understand all the technology, but they need to use it because the vendors are starting to apply this in their normal like environments. So they need to understand that, and so they have learned what territories they actually still have, and how they can actually work together better. I mean, I've seen things like microsegmentation is now becoming a lot better.
Yeah.
So the idea of the zones and conduits, they're moving that idea of microsegmentation, and I haven't seen like digital networking or software-defined networking out there yet, but eventually that may become, as you start to get into more remote facilities and having to do packet switching and a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about, using virtualization as a great example, right? Because that infrastructure ultimately, it's a cost. It's a cost to the business to run two separate infrastructures, right? And have two separate teams and so on. And I think one of the things that Lucian said in the last panel, you think about a mechanical engineer, there's just not enough bandwidth in the day for them to learn a whole new skill set, right? So how can, really the question has been, and the value proposition coming from the IT side has been, hey, we'll do all the infrastructure for you. We'll make sure it's up. We'll do your backups, right? You haven't done backups in 10 years, right? We'll take care of your backups. We'll take care of security. We'll give you something to plug into. And taking that load off of that OT team has been greatly appreciated, right? So that they can focus on what they do best, and you have the other team focusing on what they do best. I think there are still plenty of gaps, right? When we talk about drawings and design and so on. I have one set of IT documentation and Visio drawings that go to the switch, and then I've got the as-built mechanicals that are still not integrated together, right? And we still can do better jobs, but there's plenty of opportunities on both sides, and nobody wants anybody else's job. I think that's a big part of it.
Enough work, stress for everybody.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to add there before we go to the next topic?
I'll be quick, and I'll just say that you were just mentioning about this, and you mentioned earlier about segmentation. I would say that as we're going through this process, it's just a great time to then now update your asset management, and then start updating your understanding of the network. So it all kind of stacks on each other. And as you look at these things, you have to be creative on seeing how they complement each other, and how one thing might be allow you the funding, the time, and the resources to do something else.
So, and on that, I want to get into vulnerability management in these environments, and a little plug for Dragos here. Your guys' year-end report that's always so expertly done. It's really valuable. Highly recommend anybody reading those annually. Some pretty, I'd say, eye-opening statistics about vulnerability management that you guys published this year is, when considering patching, when considering the vulnerabilities of these types of systems, I think it's good advice to understand the systems on a level that would a patch introduce more harm than good. Is enough known about the underlying operating systems that are running on these devices known to make the right calls? Are individuals that are making these decisions approaching these types of patching decisions from the right perspective? So I want to pull on that thread a little bit. I guess I'll start with you, Jim, just from the from the experience there at Dragos. But what would you say there is the most important things for folks to think about when considering patching?
One thing is that not every patch applies to every system. So you don't just blanket install everything that Microsoft sends down or whatever. You have to take a sort of conscious, risk-based decision on what to apply, when to apply it, what can you do in the meantime between the time when you see the patch come out and you can actually apply it in the environment. Because that's another thing too, is that there's nothing that happens instantaneously in the OT environment. So there's always going to be a lag between the time when Microsoft or your vendors or whoever releases a patch and you can actually apply it within that environment. And you have to take that, I mean, we throw out the term risk-based approach, but it's really understanding, okay, what is the potential risk that this could do if I don't apply it within so many days or something within my environment? Is there an active threat against this? Is my device exposed to the internet? Is it, how critical is it to my systems? Can I put off doing this by adding some additional sort of wrapper around it or protections around it or extra monitoring, knowing that that system is extra vulnerable? Can I monitor for any potential attacks coming through to get to that environment? So it's never a simple decision. It's but having a process within your company to make those decisions, to make that informed decision, is really important.
Yeah. So let's talk about getting the right people to that table to make those decisions.
Do you want to go? Sure.
Go ahead.
So for me, from externally, I would say having those connections, understanding, number one, operators have to be there.
Yep.
Right? Because how do you know what systems can be updated and when you're going to have that window to update them, right? You know, somebody who does networking might think of it very differently than somebody who's actually responsible for that process, right?
Yeah.
And also the business side of the house, right? They know how much money they're going to lose for X number of hours that already have downtime, right? The threat team kind of glues a lot of that together to understand if this is something that needs to be looked at urgently or not, right? And the business decision makers have to be there to be able to agree on making that decision, right? Because ultimately we want to do everything right, but sometimes the business has a decision that has to be made and take that risk, right? You guys are responsible for owning that risk to the company. So I'll stop there, and I don't want.
Yeah, I think owning that risk, like who owns that risk, is is a big part of the
There you go.
conversation, right? And for us anyway, we generally patch our corporate server infrastructure on a monthly basis. It's just what we do. But we also have a monthly meeting. We call it a meeting of the minds between IT and OT teams, where it's a topic of conversation, right? It's on the agenda. Is there anything that we need to do? We generally don't touch the stuff on that side. Again, sort of understanding what the impacts could be, and this lends itself. It could be a whole other topic of conversation, but really in the idea of thinking about zero trust with respect to not only do I just not trust anybody who's in the environment, I don't trust the ICS device that's on the other end, right? And so if I go in with that sort of beginning assumption, how have I layered in other defensive capabilities, both for vulnerability management, monitoring, continuous monitoring, awareness, asset management, and so on, to help me manage that risk, right? Fully knowing that I probably can't touch that controller, and maybe I can't touch that controller for the life cycle of the device.
Yeah.
Right. And so just sort of keeping that in mind from a risk perspective.
And does it void any service and warranty and upkeep from the vendor that built the system?
Right.
One thing, if I can add at the end, I would say if you can't touch that system, or it's not practical to touch it more than once a year or never, then you need to, I would say, have a serious conversation with the folks that make these decisions to understand, if I can't reduce some of the vulnerabilities that are being discovered in this device, then I need to increase the amount of visibility I have around this device.
Exactly.
Because I want to know when something gets close to it that may be trying to or somehow impacting the system, since I can't fix it.
Right? Yeah, I mean, that's where the microsegmentation and other things really
enhanced monitoring.
Yeah, absolutely, really come into play and help. Again, it's all about managing the risk. Like, what tools do I have in the toolbox to help me understand and manage that?
It's also a different mindset too, of saying it's an assume breach model. Assume that someone got in, and what could they do to those systems that they can get access to if they had access to the system. So what if they're over here, how can they affect these systems over here? Can they affect them? Is there a way? Is there a path? And I don't care how they got over here, whether it was a vendor walking in with an infected system, whether it was a malicious intent, whether it was just somebody circumventing security policies, trying to do the right thing. But if you don't patch this system over here, what is the potential of someone getting from here into your systems? And whether that's coming north-south from the outside world or east-west within your environment, how do you actually deal with that? And those risk-based decisions of what is this going to do to my overall business? How is it going to affect my production downtime, my health and safety, all those kind of risk decisions?
And that further drives the point home that we said earlier about, we assume prevention is not as important these days as detection, and once detected, limiting the ability to spread once, and reducing that mean time to detection, limiting what they can do once they, a detection has been, found. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say get out of my head because we
So we used to work together or something.
I learned a few things from you, man. So yeah, exactly. We were discussing this offline. I don't think we did it up here, but it was one of those things that prevention is something that is important, but it's not something that we are focusing more as an industry nowadays. It's more about having that visibility and having the ability to respond quick, right? And that's really very important because, I mean, I don't want to say this, if you're having a drinking game, the ransomware situation with companies has shown that people are getting in to all kinds of companies that do all kinds of things, including companies that happen to have ICS environments or OT environments, I would say. Sure. It's just a ability to be able to respond quickly and detect it.
Yeah, I mean, we have a huge brownfield problem, right? If I think about our portfolio, let's just hypothetically say we have 100 properties. We maybe only have the budget to do control system replacements in 3 or 4 of them a year, right? I mean, we won't replace those systems in my career at the company,
right?
And so knowing that I can't change these things out, I'm not putting in new infrastructure. Like how, I need to know if I have a problem, right? I'm not going to be able to patch things and so on. And so it's really taking that perspective, I think, is really important.
So gravitating, back to the topic here on what's working and what's not working for folks, regulations like NERC-CIP for the electricity industry, they can have it. Nobody wants to think about fines. Nobody wants to think about regulations, but a real argument can be made that regulations have contributed to better baseline security and better controls. Carlo, can you share experience here, the feedback that you've gotten, especially from the information sharing space and the different places that you visited in your career? How, is regulation helping, hurting? What's the temperature on that these days?
Thank you. I think, I was also biased because the ISAC was part of NERC,
Sure.
but I've also worked with a lot of utilities that have told me and shared with me what they think. I think that regulation has its role. I think personally, there's some benefits to it, but as well, it needs to be done correctly, right? I think some of the regulations that have come to pass in the last couple of years have shown that if not done correctly, if not having a lot of input from the companies that are going to be impacted by that, then they can have a negative effect. And one of the things that I also personally don't enjoy much about regulation is that there is very static, right? As we've all seen, if we've done this long enough, is that the threat and the adversaries change their tactics and the way that things become more hazardous for those companies to continue to do business, and yet the regulation stays static, right? So it's having that communication to be able to update things, and we all know that it's a very slow process for those regulations to actually come to full fruition, right? Like 2 years to develop it, and then like let's say 2 to 3 years to actually have it reviewed and implemented, and then another 2 years to review to see if it actually worked. And by then, what you're trying to do was a decade ago, and it's one of those things that it's very static. So it has this place where it gets folks who are making decisions and who have access to those purses to be able to release and have a reason to release funds to be able to address that issue. So it kind of raises all boats, as the saying goes. But the problem is that I've seen also is very static, and it could have more input from the companies that it impacts.
Absolutely. How about from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, I think I'll give you the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So from where we're at, right? So COPT, I could argue, sits into probably 3 of the 16 critical infrastructure categories, right? Government facilities, commercial facilities, DIB. We have, because we lease facilities to the government, we have 0 requirements put on us. We're not, the DFAR 7012 clause doesn't apply to us. CMMC doesn't apply to us because we're not actually in a contract with the government. It's a lease, and the leasing of real property, none of those requirements apply. We really don't have anything out there that's forcing us to do anything from a cybersecurity perspective, yet we have very sensitive national level mission critical activities taking place within our facilities that are hooked to everything else in one way, shape, or form. So we've taken it more upon ourselves from the standpoint of a business differentiator to have a secure infrastructure that we're meeting some standards and requirements that are out there. And we're just now starting to see some government entities ask for a set of cybersecurity requirements for our control systems appearing in lease documents. And so, to that extent, we're lagging behind when we think of ourselves as critical infrastructure. Really, what's driven our decision making in our industry space has been Sarbanes-Oxley. Right?
Sure.
And do we have a clean audit?
Yeah.
Not have I protected my $5 billion worth of assets that are on the books that people are leasing from us. And so it's been a very interesting experience kind of getting to see what's out there. We're waiting to see what the SEC is going to come out with for cybersecurity disclosure, right? Again, being in the national security space, I'm fairly certain that some of our tenants, if we had an issue with respect to our critical infrastructure, would not want us disclosing that to the street. I don't know how the SEC is going to feel about that. And so these are some hard conversations that we're going to have from a regulatory perspective going forward.
Yep. Yeah. And as someone who's been involved in voluntary standards for a very long time, and seen sort of the mix of the regulations of NERC-CIP and some of that, TSA more recently, and we heard from the administrator earlier about TSA. I've seen some benefits to having the regulations there, and now we've got things like NIS, the NIS directives in the European Union, and we've got a bunch of other things that are starting to force the issue that people are having to look at some of the voluntary standards, whether it's NIST CSF or 62443 or whatever, where it is bringing people, bringing visibility to some of the ideas that have been around for a long time and saying, oh, yeah, okay, I do actually have to do and know something about that. Whether or not it helps or hurts the industry to have the regulations, I mean, the electric industry in general is probably the most mature out of all of the industrial sort of environments. And I will say that NERC probably helped that quite a bit.
I would agree.
There are others that are not as mature. Some of that's resource-based. Some of it's just not really knowing what's going on. And hopefully some of the more recent things within government to sort of force the issue will help to increase awareness.
And drive the conversations. Absolutely.
Can I just add one last thing at the end?
Please.
I would say I think the government has done a great job so I don't want to just say, I want to say the government has done a great job at being able to try to communicate. NERC is a good example where it's technically not the government, but it works closely with DOE to try to make sure they fine tune their regulations. And I think that more could be done to help the government bring more folks from industry to be part of those offices to be able to manage those decisions, right? Because one thing that I have seen in the work that I've done is that we could definitely use a lot more folks that have been in the industry, that have been responsible for the security of these companies, to be part of those policymakers to make those decisions. That would help a lot.
Couldn't agree more. As we get close to closing here, information sharing, from my own personal experience is we've seen the value of it. We've heard the evolution of it from especially sharing between private and public, as well as the government. We've watched the needle move as far as speed of sharing from government. I remember when I first joined the ISAC, the loudest voice we heard from the AOOs was more sharing and faster, declass things faster, especially in the face of an evolving threat. So so we know that information sharing is working, Carlo. What is most valuable, especially from your most recent work?
Well, first I want to say, it's amazing what Chris has done to open those doors up. So, kudos to the ISAC and to the Chris program that's done amazing things for energy. I would say what has worked is having the companies who have more resources to be able to do this kind of work, be trailblazers and sit down in a room and discuss what things are important for industry to know, for your specific industry to know, and have those conversations with whether the vendors or the government to be able to have access to that information, but also make sure that you have the smaller companies there as well, so they can have the perspective from that side as well. Because sometimes when you're a really large organization, you have a different point of view in some ways, but you also happen to have the resources to spend more time to understand. And typically, only the big companies are the ones that actually can afford a threat team.
Sure.
Like the kind of teams that you and I have been part of.
Right.
Small companies can't really afford to have a threat team,
Right.
but it's important for them to be in the room to understand, because they might see some of this activity before the big ones do.
Are folks still asking for I know folks still ask for IOCs, but the TTP and the behavior-based types of things, like, has that appetite changed? Has it increased?
I don't think, to be honest, I don't think TTP, if you get IT relevant IOCs, they don't really help in the OT environment that much, because it's just very different. Maybe if you're seeing beaconing or something, but in reality, it doesn't really translate well, right? Like if you get an IP address from some list, I'm not sure how that's going to correlate or have as much value when you're in an OT environment. But I think, TTPs and being able to, again, understand your environment, understand what things are critical, and to have visibility there to respond and to have access to those operators is really what really matters. Again, because if you see something that's abnormal in those systems of systems that are pretty, they kind of tend to churn at a regular rate, right? You kind of know what to expect from those environments, more or less. And we start seeing some different understanding TTPs that might be changing things.
Right.
It's a good time to reach out to your operator and say, hey, I'm seeing something different in this flow.
Yeah.
Or this this sensor looks a little weird. And they're like, yeah, I shouldn't be doing that. So
that's that was exactly what I was thinking. I was going to ask Ken the next question. It's like one thing I distinctly remember from my time at an asset owner, I was keenly aware of when something was happening, or there was news of something happening, how much the C-level was interested in what is my neighbor seeing as somebody that has the same type of business, or in the same world as me. What are they doing about this? What are they seeing here? What's important to you?
Yeah, and I think, thinking about the ISACs that are out there, right? And because I've been in different industry verticals, it's been interesting to see how culturally different they all are,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
The REN ISAC, Research and Education Network, there's not a whole lot of top down from government that comes in. It's really, they do an awesome job of sharing amongst each other. The real estate ISAC, it's more top down, right?
Yep.
You've got competitors and people who are afraid to share information because of public disclosure issues and so on. So I think that, in that sense, it's been really valuable to us, because, when we think about IOCs having a place that we can push and pull information in and out of the government,
Sure.
not being in government anymore has really helped us a lot. I think also through the ISACs, we've been able to get ahead of answering questions from the CEO and from our board. Log4j was a great example of that. All the SolarWinds issues were another great example of that, where that information was coming through the ISACs before CISA was putting out public notice to where our board members are now seeing what's the public notices come across. We already had the story ready to go.
Yeah.
We had already mitigated the risks from a company standpoint before that stuff was public, in that 24 to 48 hours ahead of time. So
Yeah.
I think, again, it's working. Could it always be better? Sure. But it's, again, from our side, it's an invaluable resource that I, would hate to see go away.
I'm glad you mentioned CISA, because just, in the 5 years I spent at the ISAC, I watched the applicability and the value of their reports. Just
It's tremendous
evolution.
Yeah.
And I think that is proof of that, active back and forth, and the kind of, I think the listening to what the defenders were asking for. What are your customers asking for as far as information sharing?
A lot of it is actually like, okay, how does this translate into my environment?
Sure.
So what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
A lot of the reports that we get on different vulnerabilities, it's like, oh my God, there's a web page compromise in a PLC. Okay, well, is that information? Is it just diagnostic information that they can access to, or is it actual control of the PLC? And where does that PLC exist? So they need that translation, and in how that really sort of evolves from the reports that they get, just these all the different ICS cert and everything like that kind of reports, and helping them translate that into their environment. And it's not an easy process because every environment's different, and you have to understand a PLC can be here or here and do completely different things and have different risk profiles. But that translation effort's really difficult.
Excellent. So with 2 minutes left, and in closing, I really want to talk about processes and people. The whole theme of this talk was what is working. We know that getting the right people talking, we know how important having OT personnel at the table, understanding IT's need, understanding the business need, and then those folks, the IT and the business, understanding what really is happening in these environments and the challenges that they face. So from a perspective of organizational planning, I've heard throughout yesterday and today, the success of tabletop exercises, process development from both internal process as well as incident response, disaster recovery, business continuity decisions. The importance of that collaboration just cannot be overstated. So with 2 minutes left, I'd like to just ask each of you to opine on that and reinforce the successes that you've seen with that collaboration.
I'll do my part in 10 seconds. I think the same groups that I've mentioned before. I think the operators, the folks that are responsible for the different functions in the business, the IT folks, the finance folks, and one thing that I didn't add before, the legal team, get them involved early and often because their job is to slow things down. So they're going to have all this process going on, and then they're going to have to do their angle. So if you get those people in the room, maybe a tabletop, however you want to build it and promote it, you get those people talking, you're going to get a lot more information. A lot of your threat information comes from within, and then you go reach what you don't get from the outside.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, so, along those lines, right? Like I said, we have recurring meetings with our IT and OT team to sit down and talk about more strategic things or some tactical stuff that's coming up. But we're constantly communicating with each other, and I think that's really important. We have tools and mechanisms in place that we can reach out and touch each other sort of instantly. I think that while we're very good on the operational side, where we're continuing to work hard is on that design and implementation side of things. When we have new projects, new construction, we're building a new facility, working through that. And I also think that by doing those things, it's helping us change the narrative that operations team believes that they can run these facilities manually if they'd been attacked. Right?
Sure.
We know that's not a reality.
Right.
And so that communication is really important.
Excellent. Jim?
From my point of view, it's making sure that all the teams feel like they're actually involved in the process. The whole idea of stop work authority for safety has been around for a very long time. But having that idea that if the operations, if the technicians and stuff that are walking the line all the time see something that just doesn't look right, like having the operators say something just doesn't feel right about this. Maybe, from a process point of view, they hear something wrong, or something just does, the tone on something just doesn't sound right. They know something's wrong. And from a security point of view, they know something just doesn't feel right. Something seems odd here. That they have the sort of like, the feeling that they have the authority to sort of like raise their hand and say something's wrong. I need somebody to look at this, and knowing who to go and talk to.
Right. So that internal collaboration, and I'll close with this. The internal collaboration is one thing, but also the collaboration with this community right here, the ICS Village and the ICS cybersecurity community. Come to events like this, talk to the right people, meet people. that goes a really long way. So it's been my honor to be up here with all three of you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Bryson, for having us, and we hope this was helpful.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And for those playing word bingo at home, machine learning AI.
Thank you again. Are we doing questions? Nope.
You got time. You're doing lunch.
Okay.
You ran out of time?
Yeah.
It's the same thing as the question I got this morning, because are there Q&A? I was like, well, each of the panels